Happy New Year, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. Welcome back to the first MMA RAXPOD of 2026 for UFC 324, Gaethje versus Pimblett out of Las Vegas, Nevada on January 24th. Thank you so much for coming back. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. I was very grateful to go over 2,700 followers on Twitter at the end of last year, which ended with quite a bang. Not only a successful final event, but I think it was the best pay-per-view I've ever done since I've gone public. I had a sweep at UFC 298, but I think that only netted about 62 units. UFC 323, we made 66 units. That was a little bit more than what I did at my previous best pay-per-view. Not my best event ever, but in terms of the numbered events, I think that was probably the best one that I've ever done since going public in 2022. So again, no tips necessary. I'll never ask for any of your money. Just please like, share, and subscribe and support the platform. Any way that you can is highly appreciated, and it will never cost you anything now or in the future. I've got 13 fights I got to get to. Definitely a lot to go through here. Year overall was good in terms of last year. Third year profitable in the last 4. Had to go on quite a run at the end of the year there to come out ahead, but who's going to shake a stick at 146 units over the last 14 fight cards total from the year? 146 units from UFC Shanghai, so the week after UFC 319. It's a bit of a shame that the YouTube channel itself has been kind of underperforming, given that the recent momentum, I shouldn't say recent, but in the middle of last year, it felt like we were going somewhere. I had 2 of my back-to-back biggest shows ever in terms of finally going over the 200 viewer threshold, and we didn't quite measure up towards the end of the year. That's a shame for not only me, but everybody else that didn't listen, because, again, if you just hung on there to the end of the year and listened to what I was saying, you would have had quite a very good UFC 323 yourself. So that being said, the numbered events are traditionally where I've done very, very well. I've had my biggest nights on the fight nights themselves throughout my entire career, but in terms of consistency, which is arguably more important, I think it's due to the larger sample size of more qualified fighters on the numbered events. We've typically done very well with those. So I'm very grateful after this 6-week break to start the year with 2 numbered events that I think we can start strong and build some good momentum on. I have a lot of plus number plays on this one. So anybody that ever accused me of being, chalk only, give or take a 1 fight, I think I've got 4 underdogs and 2 other plus odds plays that I'm rolling with on this card at the very least. Yeah, so I look forward to getting into all of those, and I am going to try to make it pretty quick here, which I think I've done a better job of lately relative to the amount of fights we've had to cover. Probably going to be over 2 hours here again, but I'm really trying to keep, especially the ones that I'm not as interested in, more limited to about 5 minutes of discussion. So going to be doing my best to get you in and out of here as quick as possible. And I definitely need to do it, because after I get done doing this, I'm going to be in Miami again for the weekend. This will be the last one that I've been doing in this apartment that I think the first one I did for this was Duplessis Adesanya. So that would have been like UFC 306 or something. So yeah, I've been in South Carolina for about 1.5 years, and I'm getting ready to finally move back to Miami. I'm going to be in the same building that I started this podcast in, but I'm going to be facing south this time instead of north. I've got more ocean views. So when the 325 RAXPOD comes out next week, you'll get to see me with a whole new backdrop again. Hopefully I don't have to keep putting up this screen in the background due to light interference, but we'll see what the new place permits. But yeah, I'm going to be focused on doing that for the remainder of this week. I will then enjoy 324 in Miami. I've already got all the work done for 325, knowing I was going to have a crazy move involved, but Wi-Fi setup permitting and everything, I should have another show for you guys next week. But that being said, we'll be focused on this one right now, doing well with this event, one event at a time, and we'll get into it right away. So thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you guys about all of these fights that we've got. I'm a lot more excited for this one, frankly, than 325. I think there's compelling matchups at just about every level of the card. There's some fights that I'm just staying away from due to the lines already being blown out, but it's not often that I absorb this much risk with this many plus money plays, given the amount of risk already in play here with running only parlays. So this is going to be an interesting card. I look forward to kicking off the year, watching it, and yeah, let's get into it right away with the first fight, which is Ty Miller versus Adam Fugitt. Miller is 6-0, undefeated, last fought in August on the first week of Dana White's Contender Series, where he won a unanimous decision over Jimmy Drago. Kind of profiles as I don't want to necessarily say a pure boxer, because he's probably shown some other stuff in some of his other fights, especially the ones that have gone to decision, but he does have some pop in his hands that I think is going to make a little bit of the difference here, and kind of explains why the line is where it's at. Fugitt is 10-5, last fought at UFC 318 last year against Islam Dulatov, where he got knocked out in the first round in the final minute of the fight. Prior to that, he had won a split decision over Josh Quinlan, a fight that I took him as an underdog in. Before that, lost via submission to Mike Mallow at UFC 289 back in 2023. Got a nice upset over Yusaku Kinoshita, the guy that was billed as Japanese McGregor that didn't quite live up to that standard. Knocked him out at Fight Night Louis Spivak earlier that year, and made his UFC debut on short notice, doing a bit of a company favor to keep Michael Morales on the card, where he got knocked out in the third round of that fight, but showed a better account of himself than I think a lot of people might have been anticipating. Now, I want to believe in Adam Fugitt. I've talked about him now at least once on this show. I think potentially twice, but definitely at least once when he did the UFC 289 show, or when I did the RAXPOD for UFC 289, which I think was one of the first ones I ever did. And obviously I talked about him at 318 as well, where I took the under in that fight, and recognizing that Fugitt was getting a little long in the tooth and that Dulatov was running through pretty much everybody he was facing at that point. I'm not sure how many first round finishes in a row that was for him, but that was 7. So seemed like a pretty good bet there. It's a little bit different with Miller just because he's only had 6 fights. But I mean, he's clearly a huge favorite here at minus 400. I kind of get the hype, just because Fugitt's probably going to want to fight a grindier, make things more plotting, sort of get to a close decision win, same way that he did with Quinlan. It's interesting because Quinlan, at least in theory, kind of seems like a similar style that Miller is deploying in terms of just being very, very boxing centric. And the way that Fugitt overcame that as an underdog was he dropped one of the first 2 rounds. I think it was the first round, but he just stayed committed to throwing an onslaught of kicks, like in a variety of kicks. And even if he wasn't hitting the head or the torso, he was content with just beating up on Quinlan's arms and taking away whatever power Quinlan had and pop on his shots, and eventually was able to turn the tide in his favor, and ended up getting a split decision. Some people didn't agree with it, but I was, one of the only people that picked him as an underdog that week. I was pretty thrilled to see it. That being said, it was, you would think in theory that he'd be able to deploy sort of a similar game plan here. The issue is he's almost 2 years older at this point. He actually just turned 37 a couple of weeks ago, so earlier this January. And yeah, I mean, 37 against 25, it's really hard to ignore how much of a difference in age gap that is, particularly given Fugitt isn't exactly someone that's brimming with UFC high-level MMA experience. He is just someone with 5 fights under his belt since that short notice debut in 2022. I would have liked to have seen him a little more active, but given some of the punishment that he took in doing what I guess were kind of perceived as company favors, it's important to remember that Mike Malone fight, that was the featured bout of the main card for that pay-per-view that was in Canada. So I don't remember who Malone was supposed to necessarily fight before then, but he almost certainly did the UFC a favor of, let me jump on this card for you guys so that you can keep the Canadian that you want to prop up on the main card. Did the same thing when he made his debut for against Michael Morales at UFC 277. I think the Dulatov one wasn't a rebooking. I think that was just a straight up matchup, but I also don't think that was on the main card either. In any event, this is a guy who has partially stuck around as long as he has because of the company favors he's done. But he's got 2 good upset wins under his belt, and he's going to need a third one here if he wants to stay at 500 for his UFC career. I don't necessarily think a loss here is going to mean that he gets cut. I think he probably does one more company favor on the way out. That being said, I do think Miller is a little bit too expensive here just because he's definitely not the more well-rounded side between these two, at least based on what he displayed interest in doing during his Contender Series fight. He's probably going to have the better moments of striking, but again, if Fugitt is deploying a similar game plan to what he already showed he could do against Josh Quinlan a couple years ago, I don't see why he couldn't potentially make this closer than it would be otherwise. That said, he did just turn 37. He's coming off a first-round knockout loss. He's been finished 4 times already in his MMA career, including 3 times by knockout, 2 of which have happened in 3 of his most recent losses. 3 of those 4 losses via finish happened before the halfway point. And you look at what the over-under for this fight is, and I was a little surprised to see that it is at plus money, given that the under in the last fight, I believe, was pretty juiced. But obviously Dulatov was a little bit more of a known force than Miller seems to be, despite the fact that the price tag would seem to imply that Miller should handle this pretty considerably. So whether that's a more of a plotting, sleepwalking, point fighting decision remains to be seen. But given that Fugitt is 37 years old, coming off of a first round knockout loss, so the durability is already starting to wane a little bit, as you've seen. And Miller is somebody that has one punch lights out power for this weight class, even if he, again, is very young in his career at this point, and all the fights that he hasn't won by first round knockout have ended up going to decision. If you're going to give me plus money here that the wide favorite, I shouldn't say wide, but the large favorite is going to knock out an opponent that just suffered a first round knockout, I feel like that's a better bet than just taking the favorite outright at, 4-1 odds, or 1-4, however you want to say it, minus 400. So give me the under 1.5. I'm going to say Miller gets a first round knockout. Maybe it gets dragged into the early part of the second and he ends up finding his connection there. In any event, I expect Miller to handle business here. I would hope that Fugitt gets one more shot after this, given the favors that he did during his first 3 fights in the UFC. And hopefully they give him somebody at least winnable so he at least has a chance of saving his job. But he is getting to the point where it's probably not going to go on much very longer for him just because of the fact that he got to the UFC so late in his MMA career and just doesn't have a lot of experience built up against the higher level fighters. I don't think Quinlan's with the UFC anymore, and Kinoshida's obviously been long gone after he proved to be a disappointment. So no wins over any current active UFC fighters. Same could be said for Miller, but again, he's only 25. So give me Ty Miller to win by first round knockout, and I'll be playing the under 1.5 at plus 146. The next fight is Cameron Smotherman and Ricky Turcios. Smotherman enters 12-6, last fought at Fight Night Usman Buckley, which I believe was UFC Atlanta last year, where he lost a unanimous decision to Ricky Simone. I took the over 2.5 at plus money in that one, and that ended up cashing. I had previously taken Smotherman against Serhiy Sidey, which did not end up cashing. I believe he was the slight underdog in that matchup. And then when he fought Jake Hadley, that was another case where I took the over at plus money, and that successfully cashed as well. So, given that he made the debut against Hadley on short notice, I was optimistic about this guy's future, despite getting chinned on Contender Series by Charalampos Gregorio. But today could have been a winnable matchup. He didn't have a great performance in that one. There's a lot of people that are, criticizing how he looked against Ricky Simone, but it's not like Ricky Simone is bad. I mean, Simone had a close fight against Raoni Barcelos. Even though I took Barcelos to win that one, he was still ended up being favored in that. Simone was. But Simone had a good year last year, I think, overall. Right, I think a few months prior to this fight with Smotherman, he had gotten his massive upset knockout over Javid Basharat and kind of reminded people that, yeah, I'm a wrestle boxer, but I'm also a wrestle boxer that can crack if you're not careful. So Simone, I think, is a little bit better than he gets credit for, but I also say that as somebody that's backed him plenty of times and gotten bitten for it. But I've just it's been surprising to me to see how many people have been critical of Smotherman coming out of the performance when the difference in UFC experience there is just so crazy, and he was a massive underdog anyway. And I think all things considered, he gave a pretty good account of himself given the level of opponent he was facing in that case. One judge did give him one round, but otherwise it was Simone 30-27. But it's not like he got massively outstruck. He only lost by 5 significant strikes, but it was more Simone having all the control racked up. Had nearly 10 minutes of control in that one, and only landed 3 of 10 takedowns despite getting all of those minutes. So I don't hold it against Smotherman a ton, especially given I don't expect his opponent in this one, the new Ricky, to do what the last Ricky did. Ricky Turcios is 13-5. Last lost over a year ago to Bernardo Sopai at UFC 311. Sopai was a pretty healthy favorite in that one, but it was a more competitive fight than the scoring would suggest. But clearly, all the moments of impact and damage and consequence in that one went to Sopai. And Sopai did end up getting 2 30-27s in that one, and one judge did score at 29-28. Prior to that, Turcios lost to Raul Rosas by submission at Fight Night Cannonier Imavov. I think that fight was supposed to take place at one of the Noche UFC events and got scrapped. Or it might have just been Fight Night Mexico City in early part of 2024 in like February, I think. Prior to that, he hadn't competed for over 2 years. Got a split decision over Kevin Natividad. Lost a unanimous decision to Ayman Zahabi in a fight where Turcios was actually the favorite. I picked him as the favorite against Zahabi. And that was coming out of his Ultimate Fighter win against Brady Heastan by split decision all the way back in August of 2021. So I think this is a case where the UFC is grateful to Smotherman for, even though they ultimately got rid of Hadley after the performance, they were impressed enough that he did a company favor and then he over delivered in terms of what happened with that company favor. And being a Contender Series vet, he's going to be a good example for other fighters in terms of like, hey, you can go on Contender Series, have a bad performance, but if you're ready for the opportunity, you can come here and make yourself an established member of the roster, which it seems like Smotherman is on his way to doing. I think that Turcios is probably closer to Serhiy Sidey than Simone, but you would be hard pressed to argue this isn't a significant step down in competition for Smotherman relative to his last opponent. It's reflected in the fact that he's favored here, whereas he was a big underdog against Turcios or Simone. Turcios, as for him, the guy, like, he's a great interview, but as much as you want to root for the guy and he can have an exciting style, you have to question so much of the in-fight decision making that he does. Not only with the antics, with gesturing and the opponents and everything, which is it's funny. People love that about John Silva. They love it when you're a fighter that wins with doing that, but when you're somebody that it ends up affecting the output that you have and your ability to go out and win, particularly against opponents that you're expected to win against, like the Iman Zahabi fight, even though Zahabi's obviously proven to be a much more talented fighter than that down the since that fight took place. It's just funny that people don't hold it against John Silva, who we're going to talk about later. And I didn't for a long time. But when it comes to fighters people don't like, they're willing to throw them under the bus for those cases. Seems like it's kind of what's happening here, which is why Smotherman is favored. Smotherman's takedown defense, I don't think has been super. It's 62%, so it's pretty around average. But Turcios, even though he's averaging just under one takedown per 15 minutes, he's not landing his takedowns at a very accurate clip. He's pretty far below average in that respect. So I would think that Smotherman should be able to avoid for a prolonged amount of time in the fight where it ends up making an impact, conceding top position to Turcios and getting controlled on the ground or being put into trouble with the grappling. At that point, it's just going to come down to, is he going to be able to match the pace and output of Turcios for 15 minutes? I don't know about 15 minutes. I would think for 10 minutes he can probably make it happen, though, if he doesn't end up getting the finish. And Turcios has been knocked out the same amount, Turcios has only been knocked out once, but he was knocked out in under 3 minutes all the way back in 2018 in the first round. So I think if you're going to make the argument that you think Smotherman is chinny based on the Gregorio fight, I think you could probably argue the same thing relative to Turcios. And it should give you at least a little bit of encouragement that, if Simone coming off of that knockout win against Basharat wasn't able to take advantage of Smotherman's chin, I don't think it's very likely that Turcios is going to be able to either. So I would definitely say Smotherman has the knockout upside. Turcios, you have to say, has a little bit more submission upside, but despite the fact that he's got a rep for being a bit of a grappler, he's only got one submission win in his MMA career. It was right before he went on The Ultimate Fighter. And that was all the way back in 2020 where he won by armbar, but he has the same amount of submission wins in his MMA career that Smotherman does. So you can give slight submission upside to Turcios, but I think people would be shocked if this fight ends up ending in a submission, especially because Turcios actually has a submission loss on his record, but Smotherman does not. And then in terms of decision, Turcios has more experience and a little bit more success going the distance than Smotherman has, which is a testament to the guy's cardio, even though he does a lot of dumb stuff. It's not like he gets tired doing dumb stuff. So I think Turcios is probably going to end up winning the third round here at a decent clip. The question is, do you feel comfortable with Smotherman winning the opening 2 rounds? And I think I do, just because it's so hard for Turcios to not be his own worst enemy in terms of putting himself in a good position to win. I think we could even see a situation where Turcios is getting out to a faster start in the first round, but makes one bad mistake. Smotherman catches him clean, and it's a bigger moment of damage than anything else that's happened to that point, while Turcios is more just kind of point fighting and gesturing and whatever. And Smotherman ends up stealing the round, ends up building off of that momentum into the second, and then is just kind of trying to survive the distance against Turcios down the last 5 minutes of the fight, and ends up getting a 29-28, which I think that's probably what ends up happening here. Again, wouldn't necessarily shock me if Smotherman's able to get a knockout. That would certainly do much more for his stock and probably be the best win. I don't know about the best win of his MMA career, because I wonder if Hadley fought Turcios, if Hadley would be able to get the win there. I would think that he would, based on he certainly accomplished more in the UFC than Turcios did, even though Hadley arguably had even larger expectations despite not winning the Ultimate Fighter. And I might feel a little bit differently about this too if Turcios had a little bit more of encouragement behind him, given the status he has as a tough winner, where you would think in a close fight they'd probably give him the decision like they did against Kevin Natividad when they were still trying to prop him up. But the fact that they were so relentless to book him against Raul Rosas and then book him against Bernardo Sopai, who was another guy that did a company favor in keeping Vinicius Oliveira on the fight night card when he got knocked out by the flying knee, which was one of the best knockouts of 2024. That immediate booking they give him afterwards is somebody that said, "Hey, we're going to give you a winnable fight," as you scratched our back, we'll scratch yours kind of thing. I don't know if Smotherman's necessarily gotten that grace yet, despite what he did for them keeping Hadley on the card when he made his own UFC debut. So I feel like they've already kind of put themselves in a rhythm where they keep feeding Turcios to guys that they want to keep on the roster. And if Turcios's contract runs its course and he's not getting wins, they're probably comfortable letting him go. It reminds me of kind of Michael Trizano in a way, who also won the Ultimate Fighter, but had kind of a letdown UFC career. And even though he won his last fight in a crazy fight with one of the rare dual knockdowns you'll ever see, I think that was against Sung Woo Choi, the UFC ended up cutting Trizano after that. So I think even if Ricky ends up winning like a split decision here, it's possible the UFC just says we've had enough. But I'm going to say Smotherman wins the first 10 minutes of this and then kind of coast to the finish line, knowing that Turcios still has more left in the tank than Smotherman does. And he just kind of stalls out to the finish, but has had more moments of impact across the first 10 minutes where there's a no doubt 29-28 decision in his favor. So give me Cameron Smotherman to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Josh Hokit and Denzel Freeman. Hokit enters 7-0, undefeated, last fought at Fight Night Bonfim Brown last November, where he got a knockout inside of a minute against Max Jimenez. Also got a knockout on Contender Series Week 2 last season against Guilherme Uriel. Hokit cut one of the most memorable, if not necessarily for the right reasons, promos of the most recent Dana White Contender Series season, and has made a regular habit of channeling his inner Hulk Hogan and calling himself the Incredible Hawk in most of these appearances. That's been his shtick, if you will. Which seems to have inspired at least part of the market, because he is now a 2-1 favorite here against Denzel Freeman, who is 34, 7-1-0. Last fought at Fight Night Saruki and Hooker in November, a couple weeks after Hokit's last appearance. Got a unanimous decision against another heavyweight making his debut in Merrick Bulo. Anybody that watched that fight will tell you it was one of the worst fights of last year. And I've been regularly making the joke, after pretty much every bad heavyweight fight featuring at least one debutant, they cut Hamdy for this. They cut Chris Barnett for this. It was not good. If you bet on Freeman, you're probably pretty happy that he was clearly the one actually like trying to at least do stuff a little bit, even though it was mostly just two heavyweights leg kicking each other and not really throwing down the way you want to see heavyweights typically do. But he's coming in a little old at 34, but I think that there's some intrigue here, just given that he kind of profiles as a bit more of a well-rounded heavyweight than what the division typically sees. This is more interesting in the case for Hokit, because this is a guy that is, although he's in terms of like frame probably not on the upper echelon of the heavyweight division, this is still a guy that is getting closer to that heavyweight limit of 265, where Hokit, he's a former college wrestler, former fullback, I believe, Division I at Fresno State. That being said, the guy's still only fighting at around 235 pounds, so not really cutting to make the limit or having to, but also against the higher levels of this division, if he advances up to that point, is going to be regularly fighting about 30 pounds underweight from where the limit is. So I'm kind of curious to see how he does here against somebody that has similar cancel out wrestling ability, at least relative to MMA on paper, that Freeman does. That was one of the reasons people were optimistic about him as a favorite against Merrick Bulo. But again, Freeman, like, even though he won, did not have a very inspiring performance against Bulo, where you wonder, is this going to be another drag it out kind of decision type of fight? Truth is, there's just not enough of a sample for either of these guys that I think you can feel super confident about either one of them. I mean, I'm gonna take Hokit, but I don't want to play him at 2-1, given that there's just so many unknowns with both of these guys. And I don't expect Hokit to gas, but he has never been to a decision. He's only been to the third round once. And I just wonder if Freeman isn't phased by the immediate blitz and Hokit isn't able to get this fight to the ground with his wrestling, where does this go from there? So I'm more curious to just observe this one and see, maybe if Hokit loses, how that affects how he's priced going into his next fight. If the UFC wants to continue to roll with him as kind of this quirky character at heavyweight in a division that kind of needs some intrigue introduced to it. And then if Freeman has a good bounce back performance himself, if he really does have more going for him at this stage of his career than what he got to show in his debut, Hokit seems to be a more willing initiator of exchanges that would welcome violence. So it'll be interesting to see if those manifest given the weight class. But at these odds, I'm just not, I just think Hokit's a little too expensive. If he does end up dipping below that 200 mark, I think at that point he's probably worth more reconsideration. But yeah, you're looking at a fight where the over 1.5 is any time, and this is something I'll talk about later with another example, but I would never, I have a rule where I never take heavyweight overs for any reason. Just there's too much variance involved. I shouldn't even say variance as much as it's I it's a sloppy division where everybody has one punch lights out power given the mass that these guys are hitting with. So it's I would never advocate playing, like, if you end up talking yourself into a heavyweight over that's at plus odds, I mean that's on you, but I'd personally never do that, and I would certainly never want to take one at juice. I think maybe one of the only exceptions I ever made was potentially the Blades Kuniev fight. The first time it was happening, and then it got canceled, and then I ended up pivoting to the under, but I might have had the under originally too. I don't know. In any event, I did end up getting it wrong with the under when the fight actually happened. But even with all the times that I've missed on heavyweight unders, I will still remain resolute that I would rather be on the side with having an under, especially an under 1.5, than an over 2.5. I think part of the thing with the Kuniev Blades fight was that it was one of the rare heavyweight fights where it was lined at 2.5. So I took the under 2.5. Now I'm remembering what it was. In any event, this is a stay away. There's plenty of other better spots on the card, I think, that you can feel more confident in. I am going to say that Hokit gets it done. I'll say that he gets a 29-28 decision, but this could end up being a split. This could end up being a very boring fight. I hope that Hokit makes it more exciting than that, but I want to see how Hokit does against a fighter that's going to be 30 pounds heavier than him and have wrestling skills that should be able to at least mitigate Hokit's approach of primary, desire. If he's not able to get the fight where he wants it to go, where does this go from here, given the well-roundedness that Freeman kind of presents, at least on paper? So give me Hokit to win a 29-28. It won't surprise me if he ends up getting a first or second round knockout, but we'll see how much Freeman has for him. But otherwise, I wouldn't bet this one, and I would just stay away from it. The next fight is Alexander Hernandez and Michael Johnson. Hernandez is 18-8, last fought at Noche UFC in September of last year, where he knocked out Diego Ferreira in round 2, and what I think was a pretty closely contested fight up to that point. I picked Ferreira. I want to say Ferreira won the first round, but memory doesn't quite serve. It was either that he won the first round and was doing fine in the second and then got caught, or Hernandez won the first round, but Ferreira had started to battle himself back in the second and then got caught. But yeah, that was unfortunate. I also faded Hernandez with a lot of confidence against Chase Hooper at the pay-per-view I attended last year, UFC 319, and he ended up knocking out Hooper at the end of the round and spoiling the evening from a betting perspective for me. So that was unfortunate. I did take him in what was an unusually contested fight on MMA Twitter last year. I did take him to beat Kurt Hollabaugh, who I figured was not going to perform well in the late rounds, and did end up just pulling guard and letting Hernandez kind of rain down from on top of him. So prior to that, got a split decision over Austin Hubbard. And prior to that, lost a split decision to Damon Jackson, which I believe is what prompted his move back up to 155 and has now realized his current win streak of 4 fights. Conversely, Michael Johnson had arguably the biggest betting upset. I don't think it was bigger than it wasn't bigger than Barcelos over Peyton Talbot, but it was one of the biggest betting upsets of last year at UFC 318 when Johnson took down Daniel Zellhuber, who was something like a minus 500, 600 favorite. Did that by unanimous decision. Prior to that, knocked out Otman Izaitar at the end of 2024. Fight Night Covington Buckley, I believe that was in Tampa, where he got a second round knockout on Izaitar there. So Johnson is going to be 40 in June, still checking in here at 39 years old. And I think this is great matchmaking. I wouldn't quite call it a crossroads thing just because Johnson is unquestionably at the end of his career at this point at 39 years old, but it's a highly volatile fight between two guys that can very regularly end up snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. We've seen it with Alexander Hernandez. We've seen it with Michael Johnson. One of the sweeps, I've come up one pick short on many potential sweeps throughout my career, but one that sticks out to me in particular was when Michael Johnson fought Diego Ferreira in May of 2023. That was Fight Night Mackenzie Dern versus Angela Hill. I had a perfect sweep on picks that night, except for one where I took Michael Johnson as an underdog, and Johnson was close to dominating the fight the entire time until Ferreira caught him with one punch that put him out cold. But before that, Johnson looked like he was going to be cruising. He looked like he was all the way back, was about to put together back-to-back wins. If he does end up getting that win there and not getting knocked out, he's on a 5-fight win streak going back to the end of 2022 coming into this one. But as it stands, you got to wonder where his durability is at, given he's 39 years old and has been knocked out 3 times, but has been able to keep it together across his last 3 fights. That being said, Darius Flowers, one of the lower level guys that has gotten in on a merit of a company favor, last minute fill in recent UFC history. Otman Izaitar, everybody memes on him for the potato bag incident at Fight Island, and kind of deservingly so, and I believe is now finally out of the UFC. And then Daniel Zellhuber, I mean, it was one thing when he lost his debut to Trey Ogden as a massive favorite, but for him to now blow this one against Johnson as a massive favorite in what was supposed to be his bounce back fight after that crazy war with Esteban Ribovics, I think it's fair to say at this point he's been a little bit more of a disappointment than maybe what people were expecting for him coming off of Contender Series. Still doesn't have a UFC knockout win despite coming in with 7 knockouts before he fought on Contender Series, and only has 1 win by finish in the UFC period since then. So despite, being young, hasn't really realized as much of the potential as I think people want to realize. So it's kind of fair to say that Johnson's own 3-fight winning streak isn't exactly built on the strongest stuff. I would certainly say the 2 wins for Ferreira over Ferreira and Chase Hooper are better building blocks for success than what Johnson has had during his current winning streak. But again, these are 2 guys that profile very similarly in terms of whoever loses the bet here is probably going to be frustrated. And I can very easily see a scenario in which either one of these guys is winning the fight and then ends up making one mistake or lapse that ends up costing them the result. I just feel like for the stages of their career that they're at, it's probably more likely that's going to be Johnson than Hernandez. And even if it's not a super catastrophic mistake, Johnson is somebody that at this point has been finished 12 times in his MMA career. Vast majority of those are submission losses, granted, 9 of them, in fact. These guys have been knocked out the same amount of times during their MMA careers. But I think the difference is Hernandez is somebody that was killing himself to make 145, got knocked out at 145, I believe, in all 3 of his appearances. I actually, that might not be the case. I think he actually started out at lightweight. Yeah, so I was incorrect about that. So he's been knocked out at lightweight actually multiple times, I believe. Drew Dober, I guess the Quarantillo fight, I thought maybe that would have been at featherweight. Because I know that I thought that the featherweight experiment for Hernandez was a bit longer than what I remembered it being. It doesn't seem like that was the case. He did get knocked out by Quarantillo at featherweight, though, so that was a featherweight fight. But Cerrone, I would assume, was a lightweight. But I think since him going back up to 155 ultimately is good for his chin and helps it in that respect. Whereas Johnson, I think, has been around 155 his entire career and just hasn't moved off of that. Hernandez coming in 7 years younger. I would think that, both these guys have good takedown defense. Johnson's got really solid takedown defense at 81%, but he's not somebody that's going for a lot of takedowns himself. Hernandez averages almost twice as many takedowns as Johnson does. So if one guy does try to mix it up here, I would think that Hernandez is probably going to have more respect or success doing that than Johnson would. And again, there's this weird rep with Hernandez that his cardio isn't good, but he's got a pretty good track record in terms of fights that do end up going the distance. It hadn't been the case in more of his recent UFC run, but it's built on a lot of stuff that he had early in his career, both in the UFC and MMA. And he's now won 2 of his most recent decisions against Austin Hubbard and Kurt Hollabaugh. In the case of the Hubbard fight, there's a lot of people that thought that should have been a unanimous decision for Hernandez, no question at all. So in a volatile matchup, I'm going to take the younger fighter with less attrition. And because of that, I'm going to say that Hernandez ends up getting the knockout in. God, I hate doing this, like getting cute with picking a round that a finish is going to be in, and it's the exact same round and finish that they just had in their most recent result. But we've seen it with Johnson before where he has a good competitive start and then just kind of falls away in round 2 from one mistake, which is what happened against Ferreira. And I could see these 2 guys having a competitive fight and then Hernandez just having a little bit more tread on the tires at the age that he's at in his prime than Johnson does at the end of his career with all the attrition mounting. I could see a result here where Hernandez ends up getting a second round finish. But I think even if the finish doesn't manifest, that Hernandez should do enough where he gets at least 2 of the rounds and gets a 29-28 decision. But I'm going to say he continues his good form and gets another finish win. That would be his 3rd by knockout in a row. And it happens in the second round for the second fight in a row for him. So give me the great ape, Alexander Hernandez, rather, to win by second round knockout. Not a ton of confidence. So it'll be interesting to see how this line continues to move. That's slowly creep back in towards Johnson's favor, but I put Hernandez out of minus 155. He's still minus 150, so still in the same range. But it'll be interesting to see if there's any movement towards the home stretch of the week. But I'm going to take the Great Ape in a volatile matchup where, frankly, I won't be surprised either way with what happens. The next fight is Charles Johnson and Alex Perez. Johnson is 18-7. Only fought a couple times last year after having one of the best 2024s of anybody on the UFC roster. Got a nice upset win at UFC Shanghai against Loner Kavanaugh with a second round knockout in the final minute of that round. Prior to that, lost a unanimous decision to Ramazan Tamarov, a fight where he even admittedly finally kind of acknowledged his problem with starting too many of his fights too slowly and building into round 2 and 3. Didn't do enough to definitively win the second round, lost a unanimous decision, but Tamarov received a suspension of at least a year, I think, for PEDs after getting dinging positive for some sort of substance coming out of that one. So it'll be interesting to see if that one maybe gets overturned in the future if he decides to appeal it. But as it stands, Tamarov did beat him by unanimous decision in a fight Johnson was favored to win. And I was riding the train at that point. I had taken him as an underdog when he fought Jake Hadley. He was a local underdog in St. Louis for that one and ended up delivering. That was an exciting fight. In the Josh Van result continues to be baffling. Cost me a huge night, like better night than I would have had at the most, better night than the one I had at the most recent pay-per-view. Like it was that devastating to have Van not deliver in that circumstance. Especially it was kind of a matchup between two guys that had a rep for being slow starters, but Van was someone that was getting a little bit more after it. And it's like of all the people that Van's fought on the way up, that's the one guy that he lost on his way to the title. It's crazy. But we got it back with Van, thankfully coming out ahead in the title fight against Pantoja, which a little bit of luck involved, I would say. But I took Johnson pretty confidently against Sumaderji. That was a more competitive fight than I think the unanimous decision would imply, but he still was able to get it done there. It's been showing a lot more power in his recent outings and staying sitting down on his strikes a little bit more. I think the jury's still out in terms of is he really gonna start as fast as he's admitted that he needs to, given how much of his approach is being a builder. And this guy that keeps claiming to be the best 5-round fighter in the UFC, but hasn't actually gotten a 5-round fight in the UFC yet. Just has had a couple of 5-round fights in LFA prior to getting to the UFC. Conversely, Perez is 25-10, is 1-5 in his last 6. And I had been pretty regularly fading him since. Now, I should say the first when he fought Pantoja, I actually picked him, and I think he was the underdog in that one, and that did not go well. That was before everybody. I mean, people knew Pantoja was a dog, but at that point, Pantoja had been not fought for like over a year. So both guys were coming off of pretty steep ring rust. But there was certainly more optimism around Perez back then, just because I think the only guys he had lost to in the UFC were Joseph Benavidez and Figgy. But Pantoja ended up putting that one away in almost just 90 seconds. I faded him against Bukauskas, faded him against Nicolau, and he ended up delivering in a big way there and kind of showing people that, he can make the flyweight limit, he's still got something for him there. The Tyra fight was interesting because I think most people scored him the first round, and he was doing fine in the second round before he got backpacked, and then the weird yank happened, and he ended up suffering an injury and losing. So Tyra did end up getting the win there, but that fight I think was more competitive than a lot of people remember. And the Almabayev fight, I was terrified that Almabayev was going to need a finish. I was very grateful that they scored the judges who I think that was an Abu Dhabi event. So I felt pretty good that the judges were going to lean towards Almabayev as opposed to Perez. So I felt like, yeah, given the judging, that'll probably end up being 1-1 going into the third, and then Almabayev gets a flying guillotine choke. It was the rare club and sub with no knockdown, where he clubbed him, wobbled him, and then jumped on his neck with a flying guillotine and kind of sat down on it without actually hitting the mat, and was able to get Perez to tap out while standing up. Great result for Almabayev, but that was a fight that in a more neutral setting, I think Perez could have potentially been up 2-0. So this streak isn't great, but even the Makayev fight was competitive and had me nervous as a Makayev better. And the Nicolau fight, he was an underdog and obviously delivered in strong fashion there against a very, very hard hitter in Nicolau. So I like I don't think that Perez is as washed as a lot of people are making him out to be. And it's crazy because like the people that have been taking him in all of these fights have been saying similar things going into them, and then he ends up having good performances, but then one thing just ends up falling apart that ends up taking it away from him. And most of the time it's happening in the form of a finish. If it's not happening in the form of a finish, it's happening against an opponent that is an extremely dedicated, strong wrestler. As good as you may think Charles Johnson is in the wrestling department, it's not like he's been dedicated in deploying that. And he's landing his takedowns at a far below average clip, even when he is trying to go to it, than you would like for somebody trying to get to the ground on their terms. Otherwise, Johnson's leaned much more heavily on decisions for his UFC success than he has finishes. Granted, he did get that knockout on Loner Kavanaugh, but that and Van, those are obviously his two biggest moments, but those are also within the last 9 or 10 fights he's had. Those are the only fights he's had in which that haven't gone the distance. And Perez, even though he hasn't gotten to go the full distance lately, he's somebody that across his entire MMA career has done very, very well when he's had the opportunity to do so. And frankly, has shown more, I think, finishing upside than Johnson has, despite Johnson's recent form. I'm not convinced that Perez is done. I can't be. I've picked against him too many times and been too nervous watching the fights to definitively say that he's done. He might get cut if he loses this one. I would hope that he gets at least one more chance. It's going to be a very interesting opportunity for Johnson. And I think Johnson is going to need to start fast here if he wants to get this win. Because I don't even necessarily think it's a given that even if he starts super like late and is saving his best for the final round, that he ends up getting the final round on Perez, particularly if Perez has already at least banked the first round, if not two of them. Johnson's never been finished, so if you're taking Perez, you're probably doing so under the impression that this fight is going to go the distance. But again, even if it does go the distance, I feel better about Perez, or I feel good about Perez's own late success in fights than I do the narrative that Johnson is just going to be able to take over late because he's a builder. So I feel pretty good about where Perez is in terms of being able to look more impressive in the striking exchanges. And if he needs to go to the ground, getting there on his terms more reliably than I think Johnson is going to be able to. The only question is Johnson going to land one shot that kind of totally turns the tables on this fight? I don't see him getting a submission win here, despite Perez's submission defense being a nagging issue. Johnson has not. A lot of people said that he had a good, I can't remember what fight it was, but I guess he had a good front choke attempt. I think it was at the end of the Makayev fight in his debut. But the funny thing about that is he had 3 submission wins on his way up into the UFC, and then he hasn't had any in the UFC. And people are saying that his, they're in terms of talking themselves into Johnson potentially winning by submission here. He had a great attempt against a good fighter all the way back in his debut. Well, that attempt was closer to the submission wins he had had previously before getting into the UFC than kind of how his style has shifted and settled in as he's gotten further into his UFC career and really hasn't relied on doing anything with submissions at all. So he's just going to suddenly flip the switch and get his first submission win on Perez. Maybe it could happen, but I'm not interested in finding out at the price tag that Johnson is currently at. And it does finally seems like some money is coming in on Perez. Johnson got blown out all the way to 230 at one point a couple of weeks ago. He's steadily kind of climbed down and down. He was still in the 200 range going into or coming out of the weekend, but now Johnson is minus 170 and Perez has climbed all the way up to plus 145. I put Perez out at plus 175 earlier this week. I'm going to say that Alex Perez gets a 29-28 decision here where he banks the first 2 rounds and Johnson goes on a feverish rally late trying to get it in the third, but Perez does enough to stay out of danger down the stretch to where he is able to avoid not only getting finished in the final round, but doesn't give up a 10-8 and give a draw away to Johnson, which is really what I'm going to be most worried about if fight plays out how I think it will, where Perez banks the first 2 rounds and then suddenly Johnson is feverishly coming after, recognizing he needs a finish. You know, something similar to what happened between Phil Rowe and Ange Lusa last year. But I trust Perez's cardio more than I do Ange Lusa's. I'll say that much. But give me Perez to get the upset here and remind a few people just, you know, that this is a guy that was fighting for a UFC title at one point. And even though he's had trouble with the weight cut and the injuries and everything since then, this is a guy where he's been fighting nothing but the highest level fighters in his division since that title fight. And this might be the worst opponent that he's had out of that group, as good as Johnson has been on his way up. So I'm optimistic in Perez. This is the first time that I'll have been taking him since that loss to Pantoja. I think he's going to have a better showing than he did in that one, at least for plus money here. So give me Alex Perez to win by 29-28 decision. The next fight is Modestas Bukauskas and Nikita Krylov. Bukauskas is 19-6, last fought at Fight Night Imavov Baralho last year, which was UFC Paris, where he retired Paul Craig with a buzzer beater ground elbow that knocked Craig out at the buzzer and caused the fight to be waved off. He's on a 4-fight win streak. Probably shouldn't be. Very controversial. One of the more controversial decisions last year was at UFC 315 when he fought Ion Cutelaba. A lot of people took Cutelaba in that one. A lot of people felt like Cutelaba won. A lot of people were not very pleased with the results of the decision. I believe I picked Cutelaba, but I also did so recognizing that I basically thought the fight was a toss-up and I didn't have a lot of confidence in it. And it ended up being that for whatever reason, Bukauskas made a better impression on the judges and ended up getting the nod there. And I think there have been a lot of people eager to fade Bukauskas during this run. That kind of explains why there's been some late money coming in on his opponent in this matchup, which would be Mr. Nikita Krylov, who is 30-11, got knocked out against Bogdan Guskov at Fight Night Whitaker to Ritter last year. Prior to that was knocked out at UFC 314 against Dominic Reyes. So not a good comeback effort from Krylov, who had been on a 3-fight win streak going into the fight against Reyes, was favored over Reyes and Guskov and got knocked down the first round by both guys. Now I picked part of what led to my great UFC 314 last year was me picking Reyes as an underdog against Krylov. However, then I thought Krylov was going to be, not having a very high estimation of Guskov and especially his grappling, which I think was a little bit vindicated by the Jan Blachowicz fight, even though that went to a draw. I figured Krylov, all he has to do is grapple, and he's going to be able to do a lot of what what Ryan Spann did before Spann went away from that game plan and got knocked out. That is not what the case was. Krylov didn't even try to get a first round of grappling in the way that Spann did. He just did Spann's second round game plan, got caught, clipped, and ended up losing that one. He's been a bit of a far cry from the form he had against Volkan Oezdemir, which I think is a win that frankly has aged pretty well for him given the rest of how his career has gone recently. But that was also all the way back in October of 2022 at this point. So yeah, there's a lot of people that are saying Krylov's too shop worn, that he's an old 33 compared to Bukauskas, who's coming in at 31. But I'm not willing to abandon ship on Krylov yet. If we get a third first round knockout in a row, at that point, I think it's fair to say the chin is shot. But if you're going to give me plus money here on a guy that has been fighting a night and day better level of competition than what Bukauskas has received, still has very good numbers all around for his UFC career, has proven a capable striker against higher level fighters, and is probably going to have a better edge in the grappling if he's able to get the fight to that realm. I think in a world where you can remove the consideration of attrition, Krylov would have far more upside here, I think, for getting a finish than Bukauskas would. But given the back-to-back first-round knockout losses last year and the ring rust prior to that, and the fact that Krylov has now been finished 9 times in his UFC career, or in his MMA career, it's fair to wonder if, how similar is the finishing upside here. I still think for a submission, it's probably firmly in favor of Krylov. Bukauskas only has 3 submission wins on his record. One of them was the Marcin Prachnio fight, where a lot of people kind of pointed out that Prachnio's submission defense was so bad that he was like, I guess Bukauskas like put the triangle in wrong, but Prachnio was so exhausted at that point he just kind of like gas tapped. But otherwise, Bukauskas did not have a submission win since going back to April of 2018, prior to that one against Prachnio, whereas Krylov, he's got more submissions than knockouts. 28 of his 30 wins in his MMA career have been finishes, and 2 of them, or he's got 4 more of them by submission than he does by knockout. So the guy's obviously a very prolific finisher, and Bukauskas is somebody that has actually, as much as people want to hold Krylov's chin against him, Bukauskas has more fight losses via knockout in his MMA career than Krylov does. So while I would still say Bukauskas has far less attrition, I don't think the gap is as pronounced as is kind of being made out to be by the recent results of Krylov, given the amount of knockouts that Bukauskas has suffered himself. Longer this fight goes, the better I will feel for Bukauskas, but when you look at the full body work of Krylov, this is still like, I think this would probably be Krylov's best win in his UFC career by a pretty considerable mile. I mean, these are the contenders you have against what people are describing as the most washed version of Krylov. You have Paul Craig in his retirement fight after all the attrition that Craig had dealt with and trying to go down to 185 and coming back up to 205. You have the Ian Cutelaba fight, which was a split decision that he frankly didn't really deserve. Cerquera, who I believe is out of the UFC at this point. Prachnio, who I believe is also out of the UFC at this point and was basically just a low leg kick cheeser his whole career. Granted, a low leg kick cheeser that somehow beat Khalil Roundtree. Zach Palga, who's out of the UFC. Tyson Pedro, who retired from MMA and pivoted into boxing shortly after losing to Bukauskas, but I think has since made or is trying to make an MMA comeback. In any event, out of the UFC. And then was 1-4 in his previous UFC stint, and his only win was Andreas Michailidis, who I don't know if that fight was at 185, so maybe it was down a weight class at that point. But I'm pretty sure that's the guy that Pereira hit with the low flying knee. That fight was a light heavyweight. So at that point, McCaldis still had to drop down to fight Pereira at middleweight. Yeah. So, yeah, McCaldis didn't really end up doing anything himself. So the only opponent that even compares out of those bunch, I think, yeah, you could maybe say Paul Craig, but overall, but not for the stage of the career that Craig is at. Maybe Ion Kutalaba, but I would still say that a win over Krylov is more valuable than a very closely contested win over Kutalaba. I was willing to ride with Bukauskas against Praknio and Cerqueira, given I felt like he had made enough improvements in the 3 fights that he had had back to that point prior to the Praknio one that he should probably beat these guys that I can recognize on their way out. Kutalaba, a fight, like I said, it was close. I wasn't going to be surprised either way. I went with Kutalaba just because I thought there was a little bit similar kind of case to here where I just thought the strength of schedule was a little bit better, a little more battle tested, and most people thought that he won that fight. And then Craig, I was more than willing to take Bukauskas because everybody could recognize that Craig was imminently going to be out, and he ended up retiring after that result. So there's some people that think that Krylov might retire if he loses this fight. I don't know what the case. I don't really know what to make of it. A lot of people are saying that his shoulder surgery, he just doesn't look the same given the age that he's at, that he, but I don't really know how that would slow down his footwork and everything. Maybe take some steam off of his punches, but again, it's not like Bukauskas is noticeably more durable than Krylov is at this point. And Bukauskas, got the nice win on Paul Craig, but Cerqueira was somebody that got put out even faster than Bukauskas dealt with him by Ibo Aslan. It's not like Bukauskas is some renowned power puncher for the weight class, not the way that Guskov and Reyes have been. So I'm not even 100%. Like, if Krylov's chin isn't shot here, it's surprising to me that he is not, if the line isn't at least closer, if not that Krylov isn't favored, because the strength of schedule difference is pretty alarming. I think this is a case of where people are a little bit rating too highly recent form, and because of that, Bukauskas is definitely giving off the appearance of a bit of a front runner to me here, at least in this matchup. So this could be my last chance to bet Nikita Krylov, and I'm getting it at plus odds. I'm going to roll with him as an underdog. I'm going to say that he gets a club and sub. I'll say that he knocks down Bukauskas in round 1, follows him to the ground, and the grappling experience shows up, and he ends up getting a first-round submission. That would be his first submission win since beating Ryan Spann a couple of years ago at this point. Prior to that, his last submission win was against Ovin St. Preux at UFC 236. But I think that he will probably have a lot more success in the grappling in this fight if he's able to get it there than he would just in pure striking exchanges. So if he does recognize Bukauskas is hurt, he can follow him down there and probably realize a finish that way. So give me Nikita Krylov by a round 1 submission. And if he does get knocked out for the 3rd time in a row, it's probably the end of being able to feel good about betting on him, regardless of what the price is. Maybe that'll be all that he wrote, but I hope that they can at least give him one more winnable matchup in the weight class that, puts him in a position to at least go out with some maybe good momentum, maybe on a win. But give me Krylov, round 1 sub. The next fight is Ateba Gautier and Andrey Pulyaev. Gautier is 9-1, has won 8 fights in a row. Last fought at UFC 320 last year, where he knocked out Tristan Vines. Prior to that, knocked out Robert Valentin, the runner-up on The Ultimate Fighter from the year before last year. Knocked him out in under 90 seconds and fought everybody's favorite punching bag, Jose Daniel Medina at Fight Night Moreno Urseg in March of last year. So they do kind of keep feeding him cans, but given the age that he's at, and I think this guy's got pretty decent star potential, just given the age that he's at and the physical profile he strikes for the division, and just mowing through everybody. I can understand why the UFC would want to bring him along slowly and make him kind of definitely a name to monitor for many years to come. Pulyaev, conversely, is 10-3. Last fought at Fight Night Tyra Park last year at the Apex, where he got a nice comeback win over Nick Klein. Kind of fought a perfect strategy that a lot of people that picked Pulyaev figured was going to happen. I got to give a shout out to Pepe Sylvia. No, I don't know. It's the Sunny joke, but Pepe, in any event, on Twitter, mutual follow, was pretty convinced that Pulyaev was going to win. I was leaning towards Klein in my initial evaluation, and I was thinking, okay, I don't want to just pick Klein because he's got the plus money. Let me dive into this a little further. And after rewatching Pulyaev on Contender Series, as well as what he did to survive against Duncan, I figured, okay, I think Klein's probably going to get tired if he doesn't put Pulyaev away right away. And Pulyaev actually showed some decent defensive grappling even on Contender Series against a guy in Liam Anderson that predominantly wanted to grapple. So I said, okay, if Klein isn't able to get the first round sub, he's probably going to get tired, and then Pulyaev can turn it around from there. And that was largely what happened. I think at least two of the judges scored the first round for Nick Klein, and he had a lot of control, but clearly didn't have the gas tank to support that kind of fighting style. And Pulyaev just totally went downhill on him from the second round onwards, and got the second round knockout with the nice body kick, and then gave him another little kick on the way down, which was nice too, before he was grounded. It's a shame that they gave Pulyaev this kind of matchup, but in terms of trying to bring Gautier along against somebody that isn't just a pure can, this is probably a good test. That being said, Pulyaev is somebody that has been knocked out in the first round before, and as we're looking at these odds for this fight, while I can't say that I'm optimistic about playing Gautier out at like 650, especially when he opened around 900, I feel like the under here is probably pretty good price. It's starting to get a little bit more expensive from where I put it out. I originally put it out at minus 200. It's now down to minus 220. I feel very good about Gautier winning, though, and it's hard to look at the most recent results and say, yeah, he had the 4-minute fight on Contender Series, or the fight that went 4 minutes into the second round on Contender Series, but every single other win that he's had during this streak on the way up has been within 1 round. You have to think that he's not going to deviate from what he's been successful with and is going to try to force the issue against an opponent that, is typically enjoying, I think, a size advantage at middleweight, being 6'4" and having a 78-inch reach. I think it's going to be a little bit awkward for Pulyaev here to be at a reach disadvantage that he's probably not had to experience before, and fighting an opponent where he isn't just like looming over the guy with the better size. He's not going to be able to manage the distance on his terms. He's going to be having to adapt to what Gautier wants, especially if Gautier is forcing the issue, and I would imagine that would be the case. So we'll see how content he is as a counter striker, not in control of the range. But I think that's going to lead to exchanges where Pulyaev is liable to get caught. He's somebody that's already demonstrated potential to be knocked out in the first round, and that's what I think is going to happen with Gautier here. So it would surprise me if Pulyaev survives to the more than halfway point, but it wouldn't be an outright shock to me, just because I think this is probably the best opponent that Gautier has fought to date pretty easily. But I still think that the guy is just too much of a physical freak for this weight class, that if you're not somebody that knows exactly what you need to do in order to mitigate an athlete and hitter like this, you're probably in a position where you're liable to get overwhelmed. And that's what I think is going to happen here. So give me Gautier by first round knockout. Not overthinking this one, but given the price that Gautier is at, maybe it'll continue to come down. Like, I would say that I feel good playing him at, I don't know. I got to move my tab over here to confirm, but I would think close to like 400 or 500 range, I'd probably feel good playing Gautier outright. So if this continues to go down, if he does end up dipping into down below minus 600 into that 500, 400 range, you might be able to feel good about just playing him as an outright bet. But I think that there's more value on the under 1.5 here, and it gives you a nice hedge in case something weird happens and Pulyaev's able to catch him in some kind of hectic exchange that they initiate or something. But in any event, Gautier's primary method of victory his whole career has been first round knockout, and they're continuing to match make him in a way where he's not outright threatened yet. I don't see why he would get enough resistance here to have that trend deviate in any way, shape, or form. So give me Gautier by first round knockout, and I'll be taking the over or the under minus 1.5 at minus 200, now 220. The featured prelim at UFC 324 is Umar Nurmagomedov and Deiveson Figueiredo. Nurmagomedov enters 19-1, got a bounce back win over Mario Batista at UFC 321 after his classic fight against Merab Dvalishvili at 311 to start last year, where he won the first 2 rounds but lost the last 15 minutes for Merab to retain his title and Umar to suffer his first loss, contrary to father's plan. Figgy is 25-5-1. Got a split decision win over Montel Jackson at Fight Night Oliveira Gamera last year. I've noticed a trend where most of the time when an underdog wins a split decision, at least the betting community is going to go out of its way to defend the underdog regardless of whether they actually won that fight or not. I feel pretty confident in saying if that fight wasn't in Brazil, I don't think that Figgy would have gotten that decision. That's just my opinion. People thought that the grappling that Figgy did was the most consequential part of the round that got swung. I don't agree with that at all. I feel like he hardly did anything on the ground in the second round of that fight. So I was pretty disappointed that Jackson didn't get the decision as somebody that took him at a pretty steep price. At the same time, people also hate giving decisions to fighters that they perceive are supposed to blow out this challenge and then don't end up doing anything. So I want to believe in Montel Jackson, just given how much of a physical freak he is for the division, but he earned a lot of criticism for that performance that makes me wonder, what his trajectory is really going to be in an already super deep weight class going forward. But yeah, other than that, what can you really say about this fight? I mean, they keep matching up Figgy with these guys that they're trying to prop up as legitimate contenders in a way that it's almost surprising that they didn't match him up with like Sean. Like if Sean O'Malley, like people are saying that O'Malley might retire if he loses to Yadong, which I think would be insane, but let's entertain that for a second. But let's say that he actually doesn't. You feel like that they're almost certainly going to have him fight Figgy for the sake of saying, oh, he just beat a former UFC champion, so now we can springboard him back into title contention. It's exactly what they did with Corey Sandhagen. It's exactly what they did with Peter Yan. It was interesting that they did it with Chito Vera, given that was, I believe, Chito's first fight since losing to O'Malley when O'Malley was the title holder. And they even, to a certain extent, did it with in terms of just trying to gauge if Cody Garbrandt was like totally washed. It's crazy that him versus Figgy, a fight between 2 former UFC champions, was the opening fight of UFC 300 on the early prelims. It's still crazy to me. But yeah, you can't, they keep giving Figgy these bookings where they're just kind of they recognize at this point this guy isn't going to be a legitimate threat to any of the actual contenders at bantamweight. So given that he's still here at 38 years old, we might as well just keep putting him up against these guys that need a bounce back in order to keep themselves in the title picture. And it'll do some good for their stock in the eyes of casual fans that, oh, he just beat a former UFC champion, which kind of explains why the line is where it's at. Umar's minus 1,500. It's just not playable. Not only is that not playable, if you go and look at the recent fights that Umar has had in terms of when he's been a massive betting favorite, it's kind of hilarious that this is where he's at his widest he's been. When he fought Brian Kelleher, he was minus 840. When he fought Nathan Manis, he closed at minus 840. When he fought Raoni Barcelos, he closed at minus 840, a third fight in a row. When he fought Bekzat Almakhan, back when Almakhan's only fight footage was him doing MMA on top of octagons that were literally carpeted and rugged, he was minus 1,300 in a fight where he suffered a knockdown in, but still ended up winning like 30-27 or 30-26. Point is, it's crazy that out of all the names I just listed in there, the guy that had the most divisional relevance was probably Brian Kelleher in his prime. Certainly wasn't Nate Manis. Certainly hasn't been or seems it's going to be Almakhan. It would be one of either Raoni Barcelos or Kelleher, but you would have to think it would be Kelleher based on how much longer he was in the UFC before he ultimately left a couple of years ago. Figgy should not be this much of an underdog against anybody, but you can kind of understand where it's coming from given low output guy fighting somebody who's far more well-rounded everywhere. I think the only potential advantage you give Figgy here is maybe a little more submission upside on the basis of more submission output. But this is Umar we're talking about here, who is one of the most defensively overall responsible fighters in the UFC, period. I don't see any scenario in which Umar loses this fight. So the line in that sense makes sense, but you're still not getting enough value out of it at this price tag where it merits including in a parlay or something. It's just not worth it. The bigger question is, does this go the distance or does he find a finish? And Figgy's getting long in the tooth, man. And it looked like he was probably going to be able to hang on against Sandhagen, maybe, if he didn't end up getting injured. But he did take a pretty bad injury there. It kind of surprised me that he fought again within the same year after how that fight with Sandhagen ended. He did survive the end against Peter Yan, but Yan has been a decision machine for a while at this point. And to be fair, one of the only two knockout losses he has on his record, or the only two, I mean, they're technically both doctor stoppages. I don't think the Sandhagen one got counted as a doctor stoppage, but it was an injury. The last fight he had in the quadrilogy with Moreno, that was a doctor stoppage. So he's never been put out. But neither had Raoni Barcelos when Umar fought him, and Umar put him out bad with one shot. So this is absolutely a case where I think Umar could end up getting a finish here, whether it's a knockout or a submission. I think probably the more likely outcome is a 30-27 that doesn't really inspire anybody, but I'm not willing to take the risk that Deiveson's durability holds up based on what we've seen out of him recently and how good Umar is. So this is an easy stay away from me. I'm going to say Umar wins the 30-27, but this, if I were going to take a bathroom break, it would probably be for this fight, because this fight is not going to tell you anything in all likelihood that you don't already know going into it. Umar is a better fighter at this point in his career than Deiveson Figueiredo is at this point in his own career. Umar is a guy that in all likelihood will be fighting for the title again in the bantamweight division in very short order. That ship has sailed for Figgy. At this point, it's just a matter of, is Figgy going to be able to go out on a win whenever he finally decides to be done in an extremely deep division? I think that remains to be seen. Until then, the UFC is just going to keep using him to prop up the guys that it really wants to fight for the title in this weight class. If Figgy loses, I think it's very likely that he ends up fighting Peyton Talbot in his next matchup. I'll say that. And I could see that happening in International Fight Week, given Talbot's a Vegas guy, but we'll see how that goes. In any event, for right now, don't bet this. Go to the bathroom instead. I don't think you're going to miss anything. But who knows? Maybe Umar will end up getting a sensational finish. But I would say that is probably not nearly as likely as he just moonwalks into another 30-27 the way he so typically has against high-level opponents in the UFC. The first fight on the main card at UFC 324 is Jean Silva and Arnold Allen. Silva is 16-3, last fought at Noche UFC, Lopez versus Silva last September, where he got mounted on a weird scramble exchange in the first round by Lopez. A lot of people thought Lopez was going to end up finishing the fight from there, but Silva, after maybe kind of frustrating and stymieing Lopez a little bit, despite taking a lot of damage from the top in the form of strikes, was able to get Lopez to kind of settle for a submission attempt out of mount a little bit and was able to roll him over. I wouldn't quite call it a reversal, but he was able to at least scramble his way out of mount, which I don't think many fighters would have been able to do against Lopez. Came out of the corner in round two, was dominating the striking exchanges, but got a little bit too complacent with all the gesturing and gamesmanship he had done. And while chasing Lopez into the fence, Lopez hit him with a spinning back elbow. One of many iconic spinning back elbow finishes that manifested last year in what many people deemed the technique of the year. I can attest to that because I was at 319 and I saw two of them in back-to-back capacity for the first time ever. But I did take Silva in that one. I've faded Lopez more often than not. I was a big believer in Silva going into that fight. Still am to a certain extent, but I do think the hype has cooled off a little bit to where some people aren't being as conciliatory, especially against somebody like Arnold Allen, who I think is really good. 20-3 record, has not fought in about a year and a half, where he got a unanimous decision over Giga Chikadze in a fight where, memory serves, he actually lost the first round and really had to turn it up against a difficult striking matchup and come back and win that fight in a 29-28 fashion. And yeah, he had the London crowd behind him at UFC 304, but that was, I remember hedging on the over in that fight, not being super confident that Allen was going to be able to deliver at a similar price, but he did end up getting it done. Prior to that, two of his three career losses took place in the form of Movsar Evloev and Max Holloway. That Evloev win, the funny thing about it, looking back, is that I feel like a lot of people, they just write off Evloev as being like a lay and pray wrestler, which is why he hasn't been getting his title shot. But a lot of people seem now to forget that, that wrestling threat kept Allen honest, and there was actually more striking than wrestling in that fight, and Evloev largely won that fight out striking Allen, which speaks to how good and smart of a fighter Evloev is in his own right, and should probably be fighting for the title next week as opposed to Diego Lopez getting a second shot, but that's neither here or there. Or it is there, it's not here. That'll be on next week's card. And then the Holloway thing, it's hard to hold that against him pretty severely in my regard. So when I did my initial run on this one, I had it graded dead even, and so I said, okay, I've already gone pretty hard on Silva's tape, but it's, Allen hasn't fought for about a year and a half, and I haven't rewatched the Chikadze fight. So I should go back and look at the. Actually, no, sorry, I have it backwards. I had Allen tape pretty well, but I wanted to look at Silva again, given he now had a loss on his resume, and see if there was anything that really stood out to me from those. So I rewatched the Dober, the Mitchell, and the Lopez fights for Silva. The interesting thing to me about the Dober fight was that I started to become more recognizing that the showmanship for Silva is more than just him kind of doing the gesturing that, makes him very endearing to a lot of fans, myself included, but can also potentially cost him fights the way it potentially maybe did against Diego Lopez. Though it's not just that he's, jawing and gesturing with his opponent, trying to get them to like do glove taps and stuff and talking to them in the middle of exchanges and whatever, turning his head away to like, the other corner or to his Fighting Nerds teammates in the crowd and, like telling Mauricio Rufy, hey, that spinning kick you did to King Green, I'm going to do it right now to Bryce Mitchell. But he also will, he'll fight guard down a lot, which, kind of, as you're trying to gesture your hands at your opponent, that's going to kind of be an extension of that. But even then, he'll be coming forward and still leaving his chin exposed. And for a guy that had not previously been finished in his MMA career, that would have been fine. But now that he's got this knockout loss on his record in a fight where he took a lot of damage from a championship contender level fighter, how is that durability going to hold up in subsequent performances? I think this would, like, for the price that Silva is at right now, if he still had the same amount of hype coming out of that Lopez fight, I would feel I think I'd probably feel better about playing him in this spot. That being said, I can understand why people are still optimistic given he was having his way, frankly, on the feet with Lopez in that fight before he ended up getting caught. And, notwithstanding him getting taken down and mounted by an extremely dangerous grappler. So if you want to say that, yeah, if you take the result out of it, it wasn't like Silva had an outright bad performance. I think that's probably fair too. Thing is, I really like Arnold Allen. Like, you talk about the difference in decision making just in terms of there's none of that gamesmanship from Allen. I mean, he can go berserker mode, but it's not like he's being a wild, reckless idiot. And the guy unquestionably has better durability at this point than Silva does. I think Silva's probably the harder hitter, but Allen is, even though if I don't know if I would say he's got outright one punch lights out power, he's flirting with that line in terms of, he can hit pretty hard himself. Even though he hasn't realized a ton of knockout wins in his own UFC career. I don't think he's had one since, and the Calvin Guitar fight was an injury. But the Dan Hooker fight was otherwise his most recent one. And that, I think you could probably say, was, if not outright, at least largely a consequence of Hooker being 10 pounds down in a weight class where he didn't belong at all. But I think he gave a better showing of himself than is kind of remembered in the case of the Holloway and the Evloev fights. I already talked about how against Chikadze he showed good determination to come back and win that one after dropping the first round. But, the Holloway fight gets treated like it was some sort of masterclass, like outing, total domination. And it was a great performance for Max. But one judge did score at 48-47, so gave 2 rounds to Allen, and the other 2 did give it 49-46. So Allen was able to at least get 1 round in the eyes of all the judges, and one judge saw an argument for it being a 3 rounds to 2 performance. And then against Evloev, that was a 29-28 that Evloev won, no doubt. But again, it's not like he got dominated on the ground for 15 minutes. He was just fighting a very credible wrestling threat that kind of mitigated what he really would have wanted to do, loosely fighting with the striking. Silva, I can't see him deploying that same kind of urgency to get the fight to the ground that Evloev just had built into who his resume is. When you see Silva deviate from the striking, it's usually him jumping guillotine or trying to sneak one of those ninja chokes in along the fence. He's not opting to retain dominant positions, but we haven't, and that's fine for what he recognizes he's good at and wanting to be a more entertaining fighter. It's just the opportunities where he's given the window to fight smart, he chooses not to do that and route in pursuit of the more entertaining result, which you love as a fan, but you probably don't love that as much as a bettor. Allen, I think, is a much more disciplined fighter than Silva is. The other interesting thing about Silva that hasn't really come back to bite him yet, and in fairness, probably isn't something that should be held super hard against him given his most recent performance in this area, is he's only had 3 fights in his career that have gone the distance, and he's 1-2 in them. Now, the most important one of those was his Contender Series fight with Kevin Vallejos, which has aged extremely well. But that fight was 1-1, I think, going into the third, and he still needed to have a very convincing third round in order to get the win there and get the nod and get the contract. I don't know if anybody watching that fight could have anticipated, at least before the fight actually happened, that either of these guys would already go to the lengths that they have in their respective, trajectory at featherweight, particularly Silva. But Allen has 12 fights that have gone the distance in his MMA career. So 4 times as many as Silva has. And he has done a much better job with winning decisions across all of that than Silva has himself. So I think the experience here for Allen is going to be very valuable. Submission upside, I think you probably give it to Silva, but again, Allen's never been finished. Knockout upside, I think it's pretty close. Silva's the guy coming off of the knockout loss, so I think he's got the worst durability, but I also think he's the harder hitter. If this fight does go the distance, I think that Allen has the experience to get the job done. It's just going to be a question, and he's already been in positions before where even if he ends up dropping the first round to Silva, we've seen him make adjustments to come back and get wins. He did it against Sadiq Yusuff back before Yusuff had his dramatic fall from grace, and he did it in his most recent fight against Chikadze. The big concern I have here for Allen is the layoff, because it's been a long time, and he did have, I think, a shoulder surgery in between those fights. He talked about how he bulked up to like 190 at one point in terms of putting muscle back on after his surgery. And so it'll be interesting to see how he handles this weight cut after, building himself up to that walking weight and now needing to come down to 145 to make weight here. So maybe wait and see in terms of how he does on the scale if you're worried about that given the layoff. But I think that this line is pretty far out of whack. It should be much closer. It won't shock me if Silva's able to recapture some of the aura that he had prior to the Lopez fight, because I did very much think that this is a guy that I could see in title contention pretty quickly, if not the champion, somebody that would give Volk a very, very interesting fight. That was before he suffered his first loss via finish. And there's enough other intriguing characters in this division that haven't been finished yet, where now you're going to have that, you have to lean durability to guys like Allen or Evloev or Lerone Murphy compared to someone in Silva who's now shown the potential to get finished and has habits that, while had previously not resulted in him being finished, and so it was harder to hold those against him. You wonder if he's going to be, if fighting that kind of loose and uninhibited is going to continue to put him in situations where he could potentially suffer the same result that he just did against Lopez. Maybe that happens against Arnold Allen. I'm going to say that this one goes the distance, but I'm going to say Allen gets the upset 29-28 decision here after Silva wins the first round. Allen makes the adjustments that he needs to get himself back in the fight and get some respect back, and takes a 29-28 decision here. Really, I don't want to say outright rolling downhill on Silva by the end, but is at least in a position where a lot of people that weren't expecting him to do well on this spot are kind of reminded of how good this guy is and the dues that he's paid on the way up. I think that his experience fighting Holloway in particular is going to serve him very well here, and that he's going to be in a good position to make the in-fight adjustments that he needs to after getting a sense of Silva's timing and what Silva wants to do in the first 5 minutes to come back and win the last 10. So give me Arnold Allen in a 29-28 upset unanimous decision win in a potential fight of the night candidate. The next fight is Natalia Silva and Rose Namajunas. Silva is 19-5-1, last fought at UFC 315, where she earned a dominant decision win over Alexa Grasso. It was her 4th decision win in a row. She is on a 13-fight win streak. All 5 of her losses happened within, I believe, her first 10 or so fights, if not a little more than that. I mean, for a woman that started her career 3-4-1, I mean, for her to be in a position where, imagine if I told you after she lost in 2016 to Diane Firmino that, back in 2016, Rose was a year away from becoming UFC champion. Imagine if I told you after she lost again to, and this is interesting, I didn't realize at first that she had fought Marina Rodriguez on the way up. Natalia Silva did, but that was actually the last woman to beat Natalia Silva. That was in 2017. So imagine if I told you after that one, at which point she is 6-4-1. But I think it's more interesting after the 3-4-1 mark in 2016 that she would be a -400 favorite over the woman that a year from then would have been UFC champion. I don't think there's any way you would have believed that, but it shows you how much things can change when you're a young fighter still putting it together. And Silva, to her credit, isn't even in her prime yet, which is truly crazy. 28 years old. You see why the sky is the limit, and it's why I enjoyed taping her when I was doing the analysis for her fight with Grasso, and I the comparison I keep making to her too is she's like women's flyweight Ian Gary in terms of how comfortable she is fighting off the back foot and circling the cage and being difficult to hit. Reminds me a lot of Ian Machado Gary, who's been hit one of his own, like one of the best bets you can make in the UFC in his own right for the time that he's been in. Namajunas is 15-7. Last fought at UFC Atlanta last year, Usman Buckley, where she beat Miranda Maverick by unanimous decision. I took Maverick as an underdog. I felt like that fight should have been 1-1 going into the third. Maverick, I think, tore her ACL in the final round, and so Rose convincingly got the win, but 2 judges actually scored at 30-27 for Rose, which I was a little disappointed by, but at that point it didn't really matter after Maverick wasn't going to be able to bank the final round. But it was a good showing for Rose. I'm in a weird spot with Rose because the first UFC event I ever attended was UFC 274, and while that event is remembered largely for the 2 elements of Oliveira and Gaethje having arguably the greatest 1-round fight in UFC history, and the soccer kick that Michael Chandler did on Tony Ferguson, there were a lot of really, really bad fights sprinkled throughout that card. And none of them were worse than what is largely considered to be the worst title fight in UFC history, which was the rematch between Carla Esparza and Rose. Rose was a 2-1 favorite in that fight, and although at that point, I wasn't betting on women's MMA. Every other person I talked to at the event had Rose in a parlay in some capacity. Everybody was very confident she was going to win. People were upset at the fight. I've never seen a title fight where the two women were just being outright disrespected by the audience for almost all 5 rounds. Hardly anything was happening. By the end of it, people were shocked that Rose wasn't scored the winner because they didn't feel like Carla did enough to, dethrone the champ. At the same time, it's like neither of them really did anything, period. So it's kind of an impossible fight to score either way. But that kind of always left a bad taste in my mouth in terms of watching Rose from there going forward. But she is 3-2 since that fight. And she's been, even in the fights that she's lost since, I mean, she's been competitive, even in the Esparza fight, which was a split. I mean, she's been competitive in almost every single fight she's ever been in. She's been finished twice, but you take away the Ultimate Fighter 20 finale, which was all the way back in 2014. So at that point, she was 21, I think. And then the Andrade fight where she got nuked by, one of the hardest hitters in women's MMA, period. And that was back in 2019 before Andrade, kind of entered her own territory of being considered washed. She's never been outright like blown out in a fight where she wasn't finished. And Natalia Silva's not a prolific finisher. She's got 2 knockout wins on her resume in the UFC. One of them is Teresa Bleda, who was finished even more quickly by Jamie Lynn Horth in her most recent appearance. And Bleda, I think, was only 21 at the time that she fought Silva. And Bleda still was able to take a unanimous round away from her in the first by taking her to the ground, which I think is something interesting worth considering here against Namajunas. And Victoria Leonardo, who in her follow-up fight got knocked out by Wang Kong, and I believe is now fighting in Invicta, and she's 1-1. Prior to that, or not prior to that, but after that, I mean, yeah, she's got Andrade on her resume, but again, it's not like she was fighting Andrade anywhere in the same form that Rose did when Rose got knocked out by her. And then Rose ended up getting that fight back in the rematch. Viviana Araujo at the end of her career. It's funny, I've heard the Andrea Lee performance talked up this week, but it's funny because in estimating any other fighter's ability, I've heard nothing but slander for how like bad Andrea Lee is, but suddenly she's like a respectable win for Natalia Silva. And then the Grasso performance was an outclassing, but I think Grasso had been kind of overestimated based on a couple of flukes against Shevchenko. I don't want to quite say the first win she had was a fluke, but the draw should not have been a draw in any capacity, and I think certainly should have been a win for Shevchenko before she finally got it back in the trilogy fight. But, I mean, you look at the line, Silva's a 400 favorite, so the implication there is that she should probably get a finish or at least dominate this 30-27. Who has beaten Rose 30-27 before in a fight that's gone the distance? I don't know how that Tisha Pennington fight played out in 2013, but Rose was 20 years old when she lost that one. The Kowalkiewicz fight in 2016 was a split decision. Every other decision that she was in from there was either unanimous or over Johanna Jędrzejczyk in the second fight, a split decision against Andrade in the rematch, split decision the second time she faced Zhang Weili, which was only 5 years ago, closer to 4 years ago than 5 years ago. The split decision to Esparza, which could have gone either way. The Manon Fior fight, there's a lot of people that thought Rose won that fight. I personally didn't agree with it, but that fight was, I think, pretty much at least treated as a 29-28 where Rose won the final round, was just a little bit too late getting back into it. There were a lot of people wondering if that was a 5-round fight, how would it have really gone? But that was also a fight where Fiora is such a physical hoss that she didn't even have, like, there was no chance she was going to be able to do anything other than trade strikes with Fiora in that fight. She still had a more competitive performance against Fiora than Blanchfield did. And the Blanchfield fight where Rose was an underdog, and she was an underdog against both of these women, but the Blanchfield fight, she won the first 2 rounds, lost the last 3, but there were still a lot of people, if you go look at how the fight was scored, that a lot of people thought Rose still won round 4 and should have won the fight 48-47. So she's not even against the best fighters in the division still, up a weight class from where she had her most success. She's still being competitive in these fights. As good as Silva is, this would easily be the most impressive win of her entire MMA career, bar none. And yeah, she's been running through a lot of these women, but this is Thug Rose we're talking about, man. This is a different, like, now we're getting into the firm, like, truly, like, elite conversation in terms of realistic contenders. And yeah, you can say, well, Grasso was champion, but again, there were unique circumstances surrounding that relative to Shevchenko. I mean, do you think Grasso beats Blanchfield or Fiora at this point? I don't think so. I'm not even sure that she beats Namajunas, to be honest. I would be curious to see how that one would be lined. I would imagine those two will probably end up fighting each other if Namajunas loses this one. I can understand why Silva's the favorite, because I think that she might be the toughest fight Shevchenko has left among women that she hasn't faced yet. I just, this is one of those lines, and it's one of the things that I've tried to firmly keep in account while I've done this. Is a piece of advice I got a long time ago from Piglord, and I've talked about it on the show before, where it's, and I talked about this last year for UFC Shanghai, I believe, when Yi Zha fought Weston Wilson. That fight, for whatever reason, the under 1.5 was a pick'em when we got to weigh-in day. And it had been 170 earlier in the week, and I looked at that and I said, it doesn't make sense at 170. It got to a pick'em. I said, okay, this doesn't make any sense. And it went, if you're looking at a betting line and your first instinct isn't, oh, maybe there's a little bit of value on that side. If you look at something, you just immediately know that's not correct. That is a bet you should make. It's the best piece of advice that I've gotten the entire time I've been doing this. And I'm not going to outright call my shot here, even though I'm picking Rose to win and I've already done it. And 1,000 apologies to Marcel Dorf, who I know is an adoring fan of Natalia Silva, and who can blame you. But when I opened the lines and I saw that Natalia Silva was 400 against Thug Rose, I just said that doesn't make sense to me. And I've heard all the way people are saying, oh, I don't see how she beats her. She fights a more well-rounded performance and wins the first 2 rounds. And I think that she can very easily get it done. I can't imagine that Rose is going to look at where Silva's had all her success and say, oh, I'm going to give her the 15-minute Taekwondo sparring match that she wants, because she'll lose a 30-27 likelihood if she does that. I think that all of the kicking that Silva does, as good as her elite as her takedown defense has been against lesser competition, Rose is somebody that is landing half of the takedowns that she attempts. That's way above average. That's extremely good. And you don't do that unless you are an opportunistic takedown artist, which is what Rose is. And Silva's going to give her a lot of opportunities to get in on a leg with the amount of kicking that she does. So I have to imagine that Rose is going to try to initiate as many clinches as she can and work down into getting single legs and taking Silva to the ground, where she can make a much more even fight than if she's just out in space letting Silva skirt the cage and fire off more offense. I think Silva will probably have more success doing that late. I don't see her being able to do it for all 15 minutes if Rose fights up to the standard of a former women's UFC champion. And she's 33 years old. It's not like she's hit the end of the road yet for what she's capable of doing, because if that were the case, she probably would have lost to Miranda Maverick or Tracy Cortez or Amanda Hebus. And I think the interesting thing about those latter two is that Rose won that fight, though both of those fights having more success in the wrestling and ground game departments than I think a lot of people anticipated she was going to have and be able to lean on up a weight class. I don't see why she wouldn't continue to have a similar amount of success here against Silva, someone who frankly hasn't been tested a lot in that department against most of the competition she's faced. And the one time she did, she lost one of her only rounds in the UFC against a woman that, again, just got finished in the first round by Jamie Lynn Horth. And yeah, Bleeda's a physical hoss for the weight class, but she was also only 21 years old at the time and had far less experienced compared to even what Silva had done at that point for herself. If you think Silva's going to win, that's fine, and it wouldn't shock anybody, especially given that you're picking her at 400. But 330 here, I'll tell you something else. There were too many times last year where I had underdogs that were graded this far out, and for the sake of just trying to maintain a potential clean sweep, I said, I'm already on enough underdogs. It's not worth it to me to put this out as a pick, and I'll stray away from it. I missed two big dogs on the same card last year doing that, in the form of Hernandez against Guram Kutataladze and Chris Duncan against Jordan Vucenic. Two of the biggest underdogs I could have called last year, and I chickened out on both of them because I was worried about them being at a similar price to what Namajunas is here. There were two other times I went on Marcel Dorf's show, the MMA Oddsbreaker podcast last year, and I said, I'm picking Alice Ardeleon as a massive underdog, but I don't feel comfortable betting her, and then she ended up winning. And then I did the same thing with Tim Elliott against Kyoji Horiguchi at UFC 319, where I went on the show, said I'm picking Elliott, but I don't feel confident betting him, so I'm just going to stay away. I kept staying off of these guys to win, despite the fact that I am graded to win. And then the year ends, and I did the same thing with Peter Yan against Merab, because I just felt more confident hedging on the over, which is great, but who cares if you hit an over 4.5 when it's priced at minus 400? At least the first time they fought, it was like the same price that Yan was on the money line. But I had Yan graded to win that first fight, respected Merab too much, so I hedged on the over, and then I just decided to go back to the well instead of saying, well, now Jan's plus 300. Maybe you could take a shot on him. I said, nah, I was too willing to believe in the myth around Merab. And if I had just gone with what the numbers had been telling me relative to the price, I could have had another big underdog. I could have had two underdog wins in title fights to end the year last year. And instead I chickened out on having Jan as a public call on that. I can't keep doing that this year. So whereas last year, maybe I would have just said, stay away from this, I've got Rose slightly graded to win this, and I feel like she can get it done. And even if she doesn't get it done, this isn't a woman that gets blown out in her fights that she doesn't get finished in. She's going to make this a competitive fight at the very least. And if this could go either way by the end and it comes down to something like a split decision, I would feel very, very good holding a plus 330 ticket with Rose than I would if I was holding a minus 400 ticket with Natalia Silva. I'm going to say Rose gets it done by split decision. And that gives the UFC an opportunity to make Shevchenko versus Namajunas on the White House card this year. So give me Thug Rose to start the year off with a massive upset, where she wins the first two rounds and just kind of survives to the third, but ends up getting a 29-28 split decision win over Natalia Silva. The featured bout at UFC 324 is Waldo Cortes-Acosta and Derrick Lewis. Waldo, worldwide Waldo, as I call him after his most recent success, is 16-2. Had a great 2025, going 3-1, only losing to Sergey Pavlovich, but had a very I don't want to call it controversial because it was like good controversial end to the year where he, I believe, was a replacement for Ante Dalia at Fight Night Garcia versus Onama. That was obviously the fight that had the Bulgarian controversy, and it only became further controversial when fight was stopped. They did a post-fight replay to confirm that Dalia had only gotten the stoppage because he poked Cortes-Acosta in the eye. Fight was restarted after Dalia already thought he won, and then Cortes-Acosta came back and knocked him out just before the final minute had started in the first round. Handful of weeks later, after Cortes-Acosta had been propping himself up as the Pirate with an eye patch and kind of taking the piss at Tom Aspinall for bowing out of the fight against Gon for the eye poke, took a replacement. I believe it was Spivak was supposed to fight Shamil Gaziev. Spivak had to pull out, and Cortes-Acosta on like a couple days' notice flew around the world, got off the plane, was at weigh-ins within an hour of getting off the plane, and was able to knock out Shamil Gaziev just a few weeks after doing it to Dalia, and finished the year with back-to-back first-round knockout wins. Derrick Lewis, 29-12. Hasn't fought since Fight Night Lewis Teixeira last year, which I believe was UFC Nashville, where he got a wild knockout in the main event, where he had looked like he had gotten hurt initially and then fired back, dropped Teixeira, was beating him up on the ground, and then Teixeira just blatantly tried to like pull himself up using the fence. But at that point, I believe it was Herzog waved the fight off, and Derrick Lewis got another big meme finish win. Man, so I think about this relative to the position I was, the way that my system is, it's pretty much, it's almost entirely likely that I am never going to pick Derrick Lewis to win any of his fights outright. He's 40 years old. There's a lot of things not to like in terms of habits, and it's basically just you're banking on a meme every time. But the thing is, the guy is a living, walking meme, and it's why he's one of the most beloved fighters among casual fans. The reach of his influence is expressed by the fact that if you're an NFL fan, Mike Tomlin, that beating his chest celebration that he did after the Steelers beat the Ravens to get into the playoffs, he credited that as a tribute to Derrick Lewis, who he called one of his favorite MMA fighters. So Lewis obviously very beloved at this point. I just remember thinking back to how confident I was that Marcos Rogerio de Lima was going to be able to handle business against the stage, Lewis at the stage of his career he was in at that point, pretty much any way he wanted. And then, of course, Derrick Lewis just runs out of the corner, flying knee, immediately wins. And I remember just thinking, wow, it's really just, he's just going to do this for the rest of his life or however long he keeps fighting, is just getting these meme results that prolong his career. And so I took that into heavy consideration for his main event fight against Taliesin Teixeira, where I like Teixeira a lot more. And, you know, how could you not, given just the age gap on its face? But recognizing that I had a very, very strong grade on Marcos Rogerio de Lima, one of the strongest I've ever had on any fighter, frankly, against Lewis. And Lewis is still just the cheat code, even though it wasn't the punching power in that case as much as just being the meme that he is for knockouts. I said it's better for me to hedge on the under here at a similar price to what Teixeira is at than trying to take Teixeira thinking that he's somehow going to extend this past the first round when every win he's had has been in the first round at this point. Like, don't overthink it. One of these guys is getting knocked out in the first round, and it ended up happening in the first minute. And I felt very, very, very good about hedging on rounds in that case. And it's something I have to take into consideration again here, because Cortes-Acosta is a fighter that the only time that I've ever bet against this guy was when he was fighting Marcos Rogerio de Lima, who de Lima did beat much earlier in Cortes-Acosta's career, back when he wasn't really checking leg kicks. I don't really know if he's made an effort of doing that to this point, but I don't think that's something he's really going to have to worry about against Derrick Lewis. But in any event, I thought Rogerio de Lima was going to have the more well-rounded skill set. Ended up getting a 29-28 decision win. But that was the only time I ever bet against Cortes-Acosta. I even took him as an underdog against Pavlovich last year. So I knew that I was going to have a very favorable grade against him, or with him against Lewis in this case. But experience has taught me that it is not a good decision for you to drink this much juice against Derrick Lewis. It just isn't. And then I looked at the rounds, and it kind of stunned me, frankly, that the under was available at plus money, given there was so much optimism around Derrick Lewis in this matchup. I've seen so many people picking Derrick Lewis across all the shows that I watched this week, and I haven't seen a lot of optimism about Cortes-Acosta, even though I feel like if he wanted to do the boring 30-27 outpoint Derrick Lewis decision, he'll probably be in a position where he can do that if he wants to. But he's also shown more of an eagerness to try to go get a immediate finish. And with Derrick Lewis now being 40 and having been finished 9 times previously in his MMA career, including in 5 of his 7 losses by knockout, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a 330 ticket on Waldo where he doesn't get a knockout but could still potentially end up winning down the stretch, assuming the fight went that far? Or would you rather be holding a plus 110 plus money ticket on a heavyweight under, where you're either hoping that Waldo knocks out a guy that's been finished 9 times across his MMA career and is 40 years old, or Derrick Lewis does the meme again that he's done in 5 of his last 6 wins? Easy call for me here. Easy call for me here. Give me the under all day. I'm going to say Waldo. They get into a crazy exchange, but Waldo just with a little bit more composure and polish in his technique than what we've seen from Lewis at this point. And the fact that Waldo's got a really, really good chin, especially for this weight class. He's able to just kind of tank the early onslaught from Lewis and catches him clean in a way where Lewis isn't really able to recover, and Cortes-Acosta goes in for the kill on the ground and gets it. So give me first round stoppage for Waldo Cortes-Acosta. Give him his fight on the White House card. But that being said, even though I have him graded to where you should feel comfortable playing him at the price that he's at, my gut is telling me that it is a much smarter investment for you to take the potential for him to win early and get the absorbed hedge of Lewis winning in what is his own most likely outcome than it is to take the larger juice and only get the potential for Cortes-Acosta to fight the most boring, albeit probably safest path to victory. So give me the under. I feel pretty good about it. But we'll see if this ends up becoming a slop fest. I certainly hope that it doesn't. The co-main event at UFC 324 is Sugar Sean O'Malley and Song Yadong. O'Malley is 18-3, last fought at UFC 316 in June of last year, where he was submitted for the first time in his MMA career by Merab Dvalishvili, who I believe that was only his second finish in the UFC at the time. Prior to that, had fought Merab back in September, about 9 months earlier, and lost a unanimous decision in that one to a fight that I think was closer than some people want to admit, but still think barring some major robbery, Merab definitely won that. Otherwise, had been on a nice little roll prior to that. Only loss in his entire MMA career was the leg injury he suffered against Chito Vera. Got that one back in his most recent win, which was now all the way back in March of 2024, so almost 2 years ago. Conversely, Yadong enters 22-8-1. Last fought almost a year ago at UFC Seattle at Fight Night Cejudo versus Song, where he beat Henry Cejudo by technical decision. Well, it was a weird instance where Cejudo had gotten poked in the eye, but it was after the halfway point in the fight. So he recognized that it was going to go to decision, or that maybe he was going to be able to force a no contest or something. It was weird. And then there was another weird, I don't know if it was a misinterpretation of the rules or what really happened there, but some bizarre instance where they got to the end of the third round, determined the fight would need to be stopped, even though they could have stopped it during the timeout when Cejudo had been injured. And then Herzog said something about how, like, no, the fourth round has to start and then we can stop that. It was very bizarre. An interesting, one of many interesting circumstances relative to Jason Herzog last year, if you've been keeping up with certain news events in the MMA betting landscape. But that being said, Yadong there wasn't any doubt he was going to beat Cejudo based on what was going on in the cage. He was only like around a 200 range of a favorite. I felt pretty good making him a parlay leg for that one. He performed pretty well. I took Jan over him when they fought at UFC 299. That was over almost a year prior to that one. So we've only had 2 appearances from Yadong across the last 2 years, which I think is kind of interesting. Prior to that, he did win back-to-back main events in 2023 over Ricky Simon and Chris Gutierrez. I took the over when he fought Gutierrez because he was a pretty hefty favorite. I did take Simone, I believe, as he was the favorite against Yadong, and did not get a performance to price there, unfortunately. But I did take Yadong as an underdog against Corey Sandhagen in that fight. Unfortunately, Sandhagen it showed him levels, I guess, is the phrase that some people like to use. But even despite that Sandhagen performance, and that being certainly his most relevant among the ones in which he's fought contenders of late, there's a reasonable amount of optimism around Yadong this week. But even with that, O'Malley's still coming in here as a pretty strong favorite. And frankly, it's easy to understand why. Looking at this matchup, I talked a lot about the first time when Merab and O'Malley fought. I pointed out how, given I had just recently finished putting together a sample of 1,000 UFC fighters going back to like 2017 that had all of the same stats accounted for, that I factor into the analysis on a weekly basis, I could see what the true averages were for more recent UFC fighters and gauge, how much more impressive a given fighter was or wasn't in a certain category relative to what the statistically significant average was. And the thing that came back to me was that, and what I should have taken into account relative to how close I had the O'Malley-Yan matchup graded was that, as much of a freak as O'Malley is in the striking, Merab is in a class of its own when it comes to the amount of takedowns he's landing and the pace at which he's putting out these attempts. It's what explained why his reign went on for as long as it did. That being said, I think for some people, it's been kind of lost in the equation just how good of a striker O'Malley is when he's on. And the stats still bear that out in this matchup because O'Malley has a clean sweep on the striking stats, and Yadong is, while not bad defensively, he's a little bit below average in terms of offensive efficiency. And you give that striking stats sweep to someone that's going to enjoy both height and reach advantages. This seems like a tailor-made bounce back spot for Sean O'Malley. And of course, the UFC wants O'Malley to win this. However, I will say this is a good hedge for them in terms of a matchup, because if O'Malley isn't all the way in mentally, as some people have speculated he is, then that creates an interesting circumstance where if Yadong does get the win here, he's potentially in the conversation for a title shot. And as they're seeking to get some sort of male Chinese star established in the Chinese market for the UFC and MMA, Yadong winning this fight would put him in a prime position for filling that role. So even if O'Malley doesn't deliver here, it's not a bad consolation by any means for the UFC. But make no mistake, they want O'Malley to win so they can give him the rematch against Peter Yan, a fighter that he's already beaten that's currently holding the belt, so that they have an excuse to put O'Malley in a title fight for the White House card later in June, barring O'Malley taking some sort of obscene amount of damage. The path is right there. I don't see why the UFC wouldn't try to be building towards that, as opposed to wanting Yadong to win here. Again, not a bad consolation by any means, a good hedge in that sense in terms of the matchmaking, but you can't imagine that the UFC wants anybody other than O'Malley to win this fight. And I think he's going to have a pretty easy path to doing it on strikes. The question is going to be, Merab kind of, I don't want to say outright exposed him in terms of, takedowns and getting held down and whatever, because that's Merab, but O'Malley's takedown defenses come back to earth after these last couple of fights with Merab, where now it's 61% for his career, which is right in line with the average. So if Yadong, who I think you could make a pretty solid argument as the more well-rounded fighter between these two, if Yadong commits to wrestling the same way that Merab did and putting this fight on the ground, could Yadong get an upset here? Potentially. But how much can you trust that Yadong is going to fight to that when he's not even averaging a full takedown per 15 minutes in his UFC career? So I struggle to see how I don't struggle to see how Yadong could win this fight. What I struggle is to come around to the idea that he's going to put himself in the best position to win this fight and not entertain a striking showdown with O'Malley, where O'Malley is in a very good position to outclass him for 15 minutes. So I'm going to say that O'Malley reminds a lot of people how good he is. I honestly think a 30-27 is more likely than a 29-28. I think Yadong is durable enough that he's not going to get finished, that he'll stay in this one the whole time, but he's probably going to be pretty visibly frustrated when he just can't quite get in the range to where he can avoid getting connected by something very consequential from O'Malley. And O'Malley is just kind of keeping him at bay the whole time and mixing up the different levels of striking. Is it possible that Yadong maybe could take advantage of, the weakness O'Malley has with defending leg kicks and maybe, take away a very effective weapon for O'Malley early in the fight, put him on the back foot a little bit, have him a little bit more hesitant instead of just teeing off with confidence? Yeah, sure. But in recent fights, I don't see where Yadong would lean on a heavy low leg kick strategy to where it would manifest itself right away against O'Malley and put the fight in his favor. I just don't see that happening. So I'm going to say Sean O'Malley gets a 30-27 and reminds people of just how good he is. Like, we're going to see that O'Malley that showed up against Cheeto and really put people on notice. made people believe that he could beat Merab the first time. Won't shock me if Yadong ends up taking one round. Maybe it's the second round and it's tied going into the last. I think it'd be very interesting to see how this fight would play out if it were 5 rounds, but it's hard for me to look at the advantages in length that O'Malley has on top of the sweep and significant striking stats and the punching power he's got going for him, which is commensurate with Yadong's. Some people are saying that they think that Yadong is the harder hitter between these two. I don't think it really matters given the attrition and the penchant for knockouts is basically the same between these two. If there's a difference, it's marginal. So if you want to give it to Yadong, sure, but not enough to where I would say it's an outright advantage for Yadong over O'Malley. So knockout upside, I think, is fairly even. Maybe you lean a little bit of the submission upside towards Yadong, but in terms of decision equity, I think that it's very, very firmly in O'Malley's favor, especially if it's a close fight. You have to imagine that they're going to want to prioritize getting O'Malley back into a position to put him on the White House card with a belt on a line, as opposed to leaning into a new star for China that they may be able to potentially cultivate in other ways beyond giving him a win over O'Malley, especially given Yadong's only 28 years old, not even quite in the thick of his prime yet. Allegedly. That's what his birth certificate says, right? So give me Sean O'Malley 30-27. Maybe it's a little bit more competitive than that. But this is one of my more confident picks of the card. I really like this matchup as a bounce back for O'Malley if he's mentally engaged, which, I know there's been some talk in terms of how much longer is he going to do this? Does he really want it as much anymore? Is he fighting with the same confidence? I think him not having to go against Merab is going to be pretty restorative for him in terms of fighting within what he's good at and not having to worry nearly as much about defending takedowns and doing the stuff of fighting that he doesn't consider fun or successful for him. I think that'll pay off for O'Malley. So Sugar Sean, 30-27, and back in the title picture later this year. And now we come to the main event. Paddy the Baddy Pimblett and Justin the Highlight Gaethje. Paddy enters 23-3. Last fought in April, UFC 314 against Michael Chandler in the co-main event, where he had arguably the most impressive performance of his career. Looked unbelievably physically impressive. Like, think about how much of a specimen Chandler is, despite the fact that he's kind of like, just in terms of height, undersized for the division, how built that he is among the lightweights. And then it was one of the only times I think he's ever been out-specimened by his opponent, because Paddy he's a freak of biology, man. The ability to rapidly gain and then cut the weight needed to get down to 155 is just, it's unbelievable how much of a freak this guy is. And he probably won't be able to keep doing that well into his UFC career. But for the moment, he's been able to get away with it. We'll see how often it can keep happening and, to what point it continues to be successful until it starts to take a toll. Because he is 31. He is pretty much in the thick of his prime right now. Conversely, Justin Gaethje is 26-5. Last fought at UFC 313, the prior pay-per-view to the one that Paddy most recently appeared at, where he got a unanimous decision in a rematch with Rafael Fiziev. He was dropped in the opening round of that one, but was able to come back and win a 29-28 decision after a rough start. Prior to that, he had not fought since the infamous Holloway point to the canvas and slug it out at the end of round 5 BMF title fight against Max Holloway at UFC 300. So it's hard for me as somebody that was at 274 to, and again, I'm trying to factor out my obvious bias for Charles here, but after watching that fight and seeing what Gaethje did when the fight got to the ground, it's hard for me to not see Paddy having a similar level of success if he's able to get it there himself. How he gets it there is a bit more open for interpretation. He's below average at best in terms of not only his takedown rate, but also the rate at which he lands his takedowns. Although that's not as far below average, I don't think, as the amount of takedowns he lands per 15 minutes. It's less than you would want for a guy who is pretty much universally described as having an excellent grappling skill set. But part of being able to use that is getting the fight in a position where you can use it. And it's one thing to use it for one round, but then you get to the end of the round, the fight's still going. Both fighters get stood up. How are you going to get it back there? You can't just rely on clubbing and subbing your opponents constantly, or at least relying on knockdowns to get fights to the floor. You got to find a way to get on the ground, whether that's shooting in space or working into single or double leg shots in the clinch, whether the clinch is in space or against the fence. You got to have a way to reliably do that. And I'm not quite sure that Paddy is there yet, based on what we've seen. That being said, striking, which needed to level up, did look better than previously against Chandler, but this is also a version of Chandler that pretty much everybody universally agreed was not anywhere close to his prime anymore. And he still had some lapses where you figure somebody like Gaethje is probably going to be able to take full advantage. If this is a point fighting matchup for 25 minutes, you have to think Gaethje is going to tune him up. But Paddy is crafty. He is. So it's hard for me to not think that he's going to recognize where he's got an obvious advantage and do what he can to put the fight where he's going to be the most successful. I don't see him entertaining an extended striking display with Gaethje. Maybe he does that in the earlier stages of the rounds, just trying to get a sense of when would be the appropriate time to read and shoot in. But Paddy's not going to hang out for 25 minutes. That being said, if you look at this strictly as a striker versus a grappler matchup, one of the things that I like to do a lot is ask the question, which side is going to be able to give the other more resistance in the area where they are not as successful? And given that Paddy is the younger fighter, has a 3-inch reach advantage, has far less attrition on him, and is coming off a performance where his striking at least looked competent, if not better than it ever has against Chandler, I don't know how you can say that Gaethje is closer to Paddy in the grappling than Paddy is to Gaethje in the striking. I just don't see it at all. So, yeah, the way that I look at it, Paddy's got all the career momentum. They obviously would rather make him versus Topuria for the unification fight in this weight class than they would Gaethje. And, I was more forgiving of it for O'Malley in terms of like, oh, is he or isn't he there in his head? Gaethje seems already very resigned to the idea that if he's not going to win, then he's going to retire. That to me is more indicative of one foot out the door than whatever has been going on with O'Malley or whoever else you'd be questioning where their head is at going into this card. So if like I said, knockout upside, I think it's pretty firmly in Gaethje's favor, even though Paddy, he says Scousers don't get knocked out. He's never been knocked out. He only got submitted very early in his career by Cameron Else of all people. But Paddy's younger, has the reach advantage, has more experience going the distance, far less attrition to worry about, and has the better career momentum at this point than Gaethje does. Both of them are coming off of similar layoffs. Knockout upside, give it to Gaethje. Submission upside, obviously Paddy. Decision upside, we haven't seen anything that would make us think that Paddy's cardio isn't going to be step in step with Gaethje's. So we could be in for a war here. And I think that would be a very interesting fight if the narrative of the fight becomes the rounds just basically hinge entirely on whether Gaethje is still standing after Paddy shoots and doesn't get in. And is Paddy going to have the gas tank to continue shooting if he isn't immediately successful? I don't see why he wouldn't. The guy is, like I said, he's a physical specimen, man. He just is. For as much of a meme as the guy is, it's unbelievably impressive how quickly he can go from out of shape to in shape. I've seen very few things like it across any sport in my own lifetime, at least. I'm not even sure. I don't know even what would be a good comparison in terms of the only guy I can think of is maybe James Harden, but I don't even think that does it justice in terms of the quick turnaround that Pimblett makes from Paddy the Fatty to Paddy the Patty. So yeah, it's hard for me to look at how Gaethje handled himself when he was dealing with the chaos of Oliveira on the ground after the fight finally made it there, and think that Paddy's not going to be able to have a lot of similar success. So I think these guys feel each other out for a round. I think Paddy eventually recognizes where he can get in, puts the fight on the ground sometime in the second round. And I'm going to say that he submits Justin Gaethje in round 2 the first time that he gets it on the ground. Once he's got him in his world, not going to let him out, and is going to be able to find his way to the finish. So give me Paddy Pimblett to become the interim champion by second round sub, and we'll be set up for a very interesting title unification bout between him and Topuria. You know Topuria is going to be an enormous favorite, but hey, the press run for that fight is going to be something very special. At least more special than it would be if we had Gaethje fighting Topuria in a unification bout, and pretty much everybody would just be saying that Topuria is going to do the same thing to him that Holloway did to Gaethje. So I'm looking forward to it, man. Pimblett is, there's undeniable superstar potential, but the only way that you get there is you put a belt on the guy, and the UFC seems to have recognized that and given him I would think there are very few guys on their run to the title that have gotten the sort of protective matchmaking that Paddy has, and it is entirely in recognition of the casual star appeal the guy has. And I think that is going to, all of those efforts to protect him on the way up are going to finally manifest themselves in this tailor-made matchup for him where he's fighting somebody that is at a clear disadvantage to what he does the best. But maybe Gaethje surprises some people one last time. I don't think it's going to happen, though. Paddy the Batty, round 2 sub. All right, that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD. Thank you very much for tuning in again. One more time, please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. This one is going to end up going up a little bit later than I anticipated, but I did say Wednesday, and I am still trying to get it. Probably went up around 10 p.m. Eastern or something. But as I prepare to have this rendered and cut up, I'm preparing to go to my farewell dinner before I move back to Miami. So I got to go do that. And then when I get back, I'll make sure that this is uploaded for you guys. But thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'm going to be busy navigating this move Thursday and Friday. And then hopefully I'll be about as settled in as I can be with a new apartment and no furniture delivered yet other than the necessities I'm bringing in my car to watch 324. Maybe I'll go to my old bar and see if they have it on there. But that's the great thing about the Paramount era is that now everybody, you don't have to rely on a public setting if you aren't able to procure the fights by other means. I hope you all enjoyed that picture I took of that guy at the Buffalo Wild Wings for UFC 323 that brought Chick-fil-A to the bar. That was one of the more unbelievable things I've seen. Walked in right as the main card was starting just to do that. But yeah, I will be back for 325 next week. That one I think has like 14 or 15 fights at the moment, so it's going to be a slog much like this one has, including all of the Road to UFC finals. But I've already done all the grading for it. Just got to jump on and record the pod, so I will be in a good position to get those all scheduled, and the picks for that will start going out Sunday, and you can expect the RAXPOD sometime next week. And then I'll be pretty busy over the following weekend as well, but I'll be around for 325 too. So got that to look forward to, and we've got a whole year to look forward to. The ESPN era is over. The tyranny of the mouse has ended. We are now into the Paramount CBS era. I'm very much looking forward to it. 3 out of the 4 years profitable that I've been doing this publicly. Let's make it 4 out of 5 and complete the win in the 7-game series. So thank you very much for tuning in. I'll talk to you all again next week. Good luck with your bets, and thanks for sticking around. Take care, folks.